Hi everyone and welcome back to a new video. So in an attempt to make a bit of a lighter, sillier video than normal, I decided to go on the hunt for some of the worst fiction ever written. And I came out the other side with a ridiculously long list of books that I want to make videos about. And the first one that I decided to pick turned out to be not quite as light as I expected, but it is absolutely terrible and potentially one of the worst books I've ever reviewed on this channel. Today we are going to be looking at the one and only attempt at fiction written by British food critic Giles Coren, and his book is simply titled Winkler. Now, for those of you who don't know him, Giles Coren is known for being a little bit of a posh boy. He is known for being a little bit stuck up, a little bit snobby, for his very harsh food reviews and critiques and stuff like that. That said, I absolutely loved him when he was on Gordon Ramsay's The F Word, and I loved him in the TV series he did with Sue Perkins, where they basically kind of like looked at different diets and foods and stuff from throughout history. So they did like, you know, a Victorian era one, an Edwardian one, back to the 60s one, that sort of thing. I thought they were great. What I didn't know about until, I don't know, maybe like a year or so ago, was that back in, I think it was like 2005, something like that, he attempted to write fiction, and this is, to put it mildly, atrocious. It has literally won awards for how bad it is. Before we even begin to cover the plot, the characters, the absolutely terrible writing style, you'll notice that Giles has a way with punctuation, shall we say. On the first page alone, you'll find that Giles uses more commas than any human should be allowed to use in their entire life, and they're all stuffed into this one page together. Not many full stops though, he doesn't seem to like them. And I say this as someone who is a big fan of the comma and the embedded clause and regularly overuses them in her own writing. Even I know that this is too much, Giles. It is too much. So to give you an idea of what we're in for, let's have a look at the blurb of this book, which reads, Winkler is bored, angry, anxious, and full of the misery of his age, but in a sick world, in a hot city, at the end of history, at the very rim of the abyss, it might just be that Winkler is the hero we deserve. Spoiler, yeah, he's not. And I wouldn't call him a hero either. Winkler, whose days are sweated out in office drudgery, sexual frustration, and a loveless relationship with a foul-mouthed Irishwoman who looks like a broad bean. He deserves so much more than these dull people and this dirty life. Spoiler, he does not. In fact, he really ought to do something about it. But what do you do? Then I'm going to skip over a few of the spoilers given in this blurb, and jump to the end, which tells us that Winkler is a comic account of one man's search for meaning, identity, and a suitable response to the burden of history. Coren's examination of the horrors of urban life and the lies we tell to survive is wild, dark, messy, frightening, and brave. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever seen a blurb lie more, so that's an achievement, I guess. Let's try it out for ourselves, shall we? We're going to jump in, do one of our deep dives that we normally do, and let's start with chapter 1. The Father's Match. I do not think I've ever read a book that opens with a more patronising opening paragraph than this. Winkler is an Englishman, and his story begins with a cricket match, whether you like it or not. More than likely, you've never played the game. Chances are you know nothing of its history or its personalities. Do not even begin to understand its laws. Don't give it a moment's thought from one summer to the next. If you feel anything at all, it's probably a sort of ignorant contempt, but the story begins with a cricket match, and it could not have been any other way. I'm sorry, but what? Giles is an Englishman writing for an English audience. Every English person has played cricket in their life. I, a person who is basically allergic to sport, have played cricket more times than I can count. You cannot move in England, especially in the summer months, for cricket being everywhere, on the radio, the TV, being played on fields. It's a thing. You have a batter, a bowler, you have wickets, you try and bowl them out, you do runs. Everyone knows the basics. You don't need to be so patronising. I don't get why Giles gets off saying that most people have a sort of ignorant contempt for one of the most popular sports in the world. I think it's something like the second most watched sport in the world. I don't understand the point in opening a book like this with the intention to immediately alienate your audience and position yourself above them and be like, you probably don't know anything about this, but I know so much more than you. It's just not a great opening, is it? It doesn't make me want to read on. I feel like it's one thing to open by introducing your audience to a topic that is going to play a key part in the story that they might not be familiar with. You might want to give them a bit of background, but this is not the way to do it. Just as a very quick comparison, take a look at how an accomplished, really talented writer like Nick Hornby writes about football in his memoir Fever Pitch, as opposed to how Giles writes about cricket in this novel. I don't even like football, but I've read Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch because I love the passion he puts into his writing and how his joy shines through with every word, and you get really, really hooked on it, and you feel his passion, his excitement. You're really invested in these things as much as he is, even though I don't give a damn about sport. It's not the kind of book I would ever normally read, but I really like Nick Hornby's writing, so I've read it. Like, if you look at his first chapter, Nick writes, "I fell in love with football as I was later to fall in love with women. Suddenly, inexplicably, uncritically, giving no thought to the pain or disruption it would bring with it." Compare that to Giles's writing, and they could not be more different, could they? Giles's work alienates his audience and immediately positions himself above them, looking down on them with the contempt that he accuses others of having, whereas Nick invites his audience to really join him on this journey and saying, hey, even if you don't like football, you can relate to this because this is how I feel about it, and this is almost definitely how you felt about things, so we can relate to this, we're in this together. Giles moves on to using one of the worst attempts at onomatopoeia and utterly bizarre writing that I've ever read. And you'll notice this terrible attempt at onomatopoeia continues throughout the book. It gets so annoying. Because at the moment when his story begins, Winkler, the hero of all that is to come, is rattling wordlessly to work, chugging all sleepy on the underground, and thinking about a cricket match. A cricket match, worse still, that was played in the grounds of a small boarding school in the English countryside very nearly 20 years ago. He will soon stop thinking about it though, if that's any help. He will return to thinking about his fears of trains, his walk to work, his work itself, which he hates and which he hates himself for doing, his home, which is rented and smells, his friends who are barely friends, and about his girlfriend, who makes him feel anxious and strangely sick, and about his grandfather, who is no substitute for a father, but is better than nothing. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with this, like the inconsistencies between brackets and commas and which one are we using for the asides and I'm not a fan of kind of present tense writing anyway like this. It's not great. The weird mix of present and future tense that Giles uses here, again, not a fan of that. I find it uncomfortable to read, but I'm aware that that could just be a personal preference of mine. But as this is, you know, a personal review and I don't need to hide my biases, I will just say, I hate this, please stop. So, again, it's very odd because he's writing here from a third-person perspective. Like, there's this narrator who at times talks directly to the audience, although he forgets that for like 100 pages at a time and then randomly brings it in, and it's very odd. There are attempts to break the fourth wall that just don't quite work. But most of the narrative is this third-person perspective, yet he still tries to write it like a stream of consciousness, and it doesn't quite work. There's these long lists, lots of asides, comma, embedded clause, brackets, and it doesn't really work for what he's saying. It gives the impression of the author being kind of mixed up and not really thinking things through, instead of giving us an insight into a particular character's mind. And I think the other thing that we can take away from this, one of the very first opening passages, is that Giles is clearly trying to make his work good, his writing good, almost poetic, you know. He's using a lot of literary devices here that we can point out, you know, things like rattling wordlessly to work, you've got a little alliteration, that's hard to say, chugging, you've got some onomatopoeia, which he hates, which is rented, there's a little attempt at anaphora there. But it's all just done so poorly and without any real purpose that it ends up falling flat and sounding juvenile. It reads like a Year 7's piece of creative writing whose homework was to use each of these literary devices in a sentence, and he's just done that and thrown them all together, rather than him actually using literary devices with a purpose. Giles then does this really weird thing on the very first page where he tells us everything that is going to happen in the rest of the book. It's like weird future exposition. I don't know why he does this. I've now read the whole book and I still don't understand why he told us it all straight out. I'm not sure if it's meant to be some attempt at like foreshadowing or to tease us about what's to come and try and make us excited about the rest of the book, but it doesn't make you excited to read the book. It serves no real purpose. Even at the end of the book, you're like, well, why did he tell us that? Realising that he has forgotten his keys, Winkler will find himself trapped in the home of the old Jew that lives under the stairs, and we will be forced to sit, silent like Winkler, while the old Jew talks on and on and on about the war, the terrible things he saw in Warsaw, and in the forests of western and central Poland, and the terrible things he did. There will be burnings, and beheadings, and throat cuttings, rape, and infanticide, and gas. I'm just realising now as well, this is inaccurate. This is not what happens. He doesn't actually forget his keys. He lies that he forgets his keys because he's off doing something weird and like nosying some other people's belongings. So this is incorrect. But that aside, this is meant to be, I think, shocking to the reader, you know, ooh, look at all these horrible things that are coming up. But it doesn't really come across as shocking. It comes across as the author being dismissive of what is an incredibly serious and harmful portion of history, which should be dealt with respect. And it's just not. We will see Winkler profoundly affected by the story he hears, an old story full of old horrors from a continent that no longer exists, come to haunt Winkler in the modern world, and we will see his friends and his work colleagues, his girlfriend and his grandfather fail to understand the pain of his empathy, and we will witness a terrible assault on a blind girl in a piss-smelling subway underpass, and we will see what happens when Winkler tries to help her, and we will see him push a fat woman under a train. We will see Winkler out of his mind on pills and powder, being sodomized against his will as far as we can tell, wanted for murder and hunted by the police. We will see him dance and sing, and we will see him in prison. We will see an armed robbery go horribly wrong, blood and rhinestones everywhere. I don't remember that bit. If it did, it was forgettable. We will see an immigrant die shivering above an English pub. Did that happen? Winkler weeping on his grandfather's bed, and in the final pages, following a coffin to the grave. And then it will end, and you will be glad that at least there was the cricket match. Well, guess now we don't need to read the rest of the book, do we? It's told us everything. No, but I guess the point is trying to be that this is more about the journey than plot point. We're meant to be invested in the journey and how we get there rather than what actually happens. The problem is, the journey is absolute crap. Then we cut back to our main character, who we know only as Winkler, and that is the only name we'll know him as throughout the book. I don't know if that's a first name, a surname. He's just Winkler. He is on the train, on his way to work, thinking back to a cricket match at a posh kid's school between the school team and a team made up of some of the students' dads. In the evening, prickly with heat and grass seed, the winners and losers return to the pavilion for supper. The boys delighted to be finished with junior school forever, the fathers grief-stricken at the passing of another tide mark in their adulthood, and everyone, even the mothers, overjoyed to be English. So again, I'm already seeing weird contradictions. The cricket match made everyone overjoyed to be English, even though a page ago the author was being like, oh yeah, most English people have like this ignorant contempt for cricket and don't even know what it is. I'm confused, make up your mind. Is it an obscure sport that no one knows, or is it a quintessential English pastime? Make up your mind, Giles. So from what I can tell, this match happened back when Winkler was a student himself, last year of junior school, so he must have been, 10, 11, something like that. And he was a student who didn't even care for cricket, didn't even like cricket, but he was just so insanely gifted and talented that he just had to play. They made him because he was just so good at it. Yeah, I know, it's one of those. And of course, the blame for him having to play cricket is placed on the, and I quote, the arse-fancying cricket master, which I can't tell if it's a homophobic poor attempt at a joke or a disrespectful attempt at a joke about child predators. Either way, it's disrespectful and bad. And either way, it makes me uncomfortable. And it is the first of many, many times in this book where we will see just the most horrific things being said. This is mild, you know? I should also add that the discomfort I feel is aimed towards the author and not the character. Not great, is it? Giles attempts to keep making edgy jokes through his character of Winkler and have him, even as a 13-year-old boy, appear cynical and deep and, oh, he's so thoughtful, he has all these thoughts, but really it just makes him seem pathetic and unlikable. That said, I can imagine like an 18-year-old boy who's in their first year studying for a philosophy degree and you know, they've just discovered nihilism, reading this and being like, oh my god, can you believe it? He understands the world, he really sees what the world is all about. I think they're the only people who would like this book. The cricket ground was close to a churchyard, much like Winkler imagined, the sort of places the rest of the team would be buried in. Did the walls and iron gate with old headstones and willow trees visible through dips and cracks look the same to them as they did to Winkler, who would be buried in a half-unfinished row in a non-denominational municipal cemetery beside a suburban dual carriageway? Ooh, so deep. There's some confused, rambling reminiscing about the war and ancestors and cricketers from the past. From this we learn that Winkler is a Jewish man whose ancestors were Polish, and many suffered and were sadly killed during the Holocaust. This is just like Giles. Although his grandfather and great-grandfather didn't die or were killed during the Holocaust, they were okay. They lived well into and past their 90s, one of them even surpassing 100 years old. So I do feel like in many ways Winkler is a little bit of a self-insert character for Giles. There's writing what you know, and then there's just putting yourself in a story, you know? Winkler also starts making comparisons between his direct ancestors, who he knew nothing about, and cricketers who fought in the war, who he was obviously not related to, but felt closer to because they had this bond over both playing cricket. Winkler had his own imagined ancestry, not photographed, containing bearded, thick-set poles with side locks in a wet shtetl, hope I'm pronouncing that right, nodding over some Talmudic riddle, or out in fields breaking bad earth with wooden tools to plant potatoes. But it didn't make his belly clenched with longing, and he had no idea at all what games they played. And yet he only had to think of round-arm bowling or Ranjit Singh and the giants of Hambledon with their curved sticks, or old-style spiky batting gloves, to feel a rush of incapacitating nostalgia and heartbreak. Hedley Verity did not come back from the war. Chest wounds sustained in a Sicilian cornfield, leading his men under heavy fire, killed the greatest English bowler of his or any other generation. Almost none of Winkler's recent ancestors came back from the war. They didn't even go to it. They were just gassed in their dozens or shot in forests. Why, of the two, was it the fate of the quickish left-armed finger spinner that made Winkler want to cry? What was cricket to him? He was the only one in his family who could ever have told you who Don Bradman was. Now, this is a topic that is incredibly emotive, and it could be really interesting to examine. This idea of, like, us having ancestors and history, and especially for a Jewish kid, being, like, wanting to understand where you come from, but at the same time feeling separate from them, and feeling like you're unable to relate to them, but having another group of people who you share this common interest with, who technically, you know, you're not related, you don't have, for example, like, a race or a history or traditions in common, but you do have this like love of the sport and you can feel closer to them. And it's this kind of idea of like, well, who are we? What forms our identity? What defines family? They are interesting things that would be interesting to examine. Looking at how horrific events throughout history push some of us apart and pull some of us together, and the differences and why that is. Like, I would like to read that book. That's not what this book is. It's the start of something that could be interesting, but it's so poorly executioned, we never get any actual exploration of these genuinely interesting and important topics. Anyway, the father-son cricket match is causing a bunch of stress because little mini child Winkler doesn't know where his father is, and we're told his grandfather wouldn't tell him, because if you find him, it will only make you sad. And he had a point. Having no parents was marginally better than having Jewish parents, but it didn't help with what to do about the cricket match. Now again, I think this could be really, really interesting. And I guess this theme of Winkler not wanting to acknowledge that he's Jewish is something that comes up again and again and again throughout the book. And again, this is something that could be really interesting to explore. And I think especially with the time when this is set, like when this cricket match is happening was 1982, and that was a really big year in the UK because that's actually the year that the BNP was founded, the British National Party, who are well known for being anti-Semitic, racist, against immigration, and basically awful, terrible human beings. We do not like the BNP. So seeing a Jewish kid internalizing some of the hatred that was so prevalent in that era in Britain could have been really, really interesting. But instead, this is all we ever get. These throwaway lines that aren't examined. We don't understand why Winkler feels this way, what has made him feel like this. We don't really see any of the experiences that happened to him. There's one little scene we get later where it's like he tells about some bullying he had in school, but again, it's all done as kind of like a throwaway comment rather than as something actually to be explored and examined, and it's just, the execution isn't there. So Winkler doesn't know who his dad is, he's not around, he can't play in the cricket match, so him and his grandfather try and think of someone to fill in at the cricket match, and there's a bit of racism and internalized anti-Semitism shown, which again could have been a great way of showing intolerances in society at the time, but they're just sort of placed there and we're told to accept them as normal without them ever being really examined or questioned, and so I feel like it's a little bit pointless. It feels like this was maybe an attempt at world building that just didn't work, because it kind of makes it seem like, oh yeah, racism is so normal and okay, rather than, oh my god, can you believe that racism was once thought to be normal and okay? Let's examine that. Do you know what I mean? There's a difference. Give you some quotes from this. Maurice then, eh? How about that? Winkler said nothing. A shame because he's such a Jew? No. You think Sammy Patel plays cricket? They do, these Indians. Or not? Yeah, he probably does, Grandpa, but he doesn't look much like my dad. At least he's not Jewish. Anyway, how do you know what your papa looks like? That photo's 15 years old. What we do know of his dad is that he seems dodgy as hell, as you can tell from this passage on screen. In the end, they get a guy who they call Ginger Bill to play the role of his father, and Giles tries to flesh out Ginger Bill with a backstory, which ends up being ludicrous rather than deep. It's just... Ginger Bill was a gentleman, named after his bright red beard more than the strawberry pink of the hair that thinned on his head, and he was bottom heavy, with trousers that hung low under his belly. Winkler remembered now the rumour that Bill had been one of the Cray's bodyguards back in the early days, recruited when they saw him killing horses with his bare hands at a long-gone stud farm up in Elstree that was run by his uncle, Black Les. Bill had spent time in prison, fingered, said the old man, for his part in an arson attack on a Quaker school, a crime of which he was innocent. Inside he did while trafficking in drugs, which he had smuggled into him in piles of freshly laundered prayer shawls. And by 1982, the year of the father's match, he was living the life of a respectable man of leisure in the northern suburbs. You see what I mean? Also, they really do just, like, throw a bunch of exposition at you. It's just frustrating. So Ginger Bill, I can't believe I'm calling him that, turns up at the cricket match, and there's a bunch more offensive jokes and names thrown around, and again, this feels less like a statement on the culture at the time, although it was common back then and we need to acknowledge that, and more about the author just enjoying being offensive because he thinks he can get away with it, you know? It adds nothing to the story other than making the reader uncomfortable in a way that wasn't the author's intention, because it feels more like these are Giles's views than the character's views. Do you know what I mean? So the cricket match happens, Bill is terrible at batting and is immediately out straight away, and he proceeds to get slowly drunker and drunker as the day goes on. I'll skip over a lot of this because it's boring. Like, there are 2 cricket matches in this book and they're both really, really dull. There is no tension, you do not really care what's happening. It's just like, this happened and this was the score, and then this happened and then Bill had a drink and then this happened and then this was the score. That's it. Again, to be cheeky and compare this to Nick Hornby's Fever Pitch, Nick Hornby manages to write these stories in his memoir in such a way that you feel genuinely excited about the matches, and again, I say this as someone with no interest or knowledge in sport, you feel like every up and down with him, and you get tense, and you're like, oh my god. And that's especially heightened, I think, in the matches he attended when he was a kid, because, you know, those matches really helped inform his identity and taught him so much about himself, his father, the world around him. People come together as this big community, and you get that childlike excitement in the writing, and it's brilliant. But Giles's writing doesn't do that. You don't really get any real excitement for cricket. You just get the sense that, like, Winkler's character isn't invested in the match. You don't even get the sense that he's playing in the match. He's just there telling you, and this happened, and then this was the score. There's just this emotional disconnect. It's a lot of telling and not showing, and there's no tension, no excitement. Like, and I didn't even know which side we were meant to be rooting for, parents or students, I don't know. Even the thing with, like, Bill getting drunker and drunker throughout the day, I was like, but what does this mean? Are there going to be good consequences of this or bad consequences of this? Is Winkler happy he's getting drunk and making friends with the other parents? Or is he anxious because he thinks he's going to get drunk and make a fool of himself? I had no idea what anyone was feeling. And it was never explained. We're never shown any of that. I was just like, okay, I guess. You know, I do actually complain a lot about writers telling us rather than showing us, but Giles doesn't even tell us. He just misses out big chunks of it. I think it's like he was writing this and he just forgot that these characters are supposed to have feelings and thoughts and reactions and motivations, and he just missed all that out. Anyway, when the match does end, it's a close score. Winkler's up to bat last with some rich kid who, I can't remember his name, I don't have it written down, but he comes back up later. Just remember rich kid from school, right? Winkler bats on his first bat, Bill catches him out, so that Dad's team all win, and Winkler calls him Uncle Bill, and I think he's meant to be, like, proud of him and, like, accepting him as, like, part of the family or something like that. It's hard to tell because for, like, 3 pages, the reactions are just so blank. There's nothing there. There was, like, one good little bit of dialogue at the end of this where, when they're going home and they're on the way back to the house to see his granddad and stuff like that, Winkler, as a kid, impatient with the silently passing seconds, he shouted, "Grandpa, Grandpa, they won! Bill did it all! Grandpa, Grandpa!" Great, cool, I want to see more of that. That's the excitement that we want. That's telling us how he's feeling, or showing us how he's feeling. We're getting that pride, that excitement, that, like, yeah, I finally got someone who can be a father figure. Great, love that. Why is there not more of that? And then the chapter ends back in the present day and Winkler gets off the train. And then there's just a little bunch of nothing, and we're on the train platform and we're going into chapter 2. Now, Uncle Bill I thought was going to be a reoccurring character who came back, and, you know, that, like, father-like relationship was going to come up again. He does come back in, like, the second to last chapter, more for convenience than for meaning. We'll see when we get there. Chapter 2 is titled Winkler's Fear of Trains. Decided to have a go at my own little bit of novel writing here. You know, I don't think that chapter was edgy enough towards the end of it. It seemed a bit normal, thought Giles to himself while writing this. We better fix that. And that's exactly what he did with this chapter. It is the edgiest of all the chapters in the book, and that is not a good thing. Winkler stood waiting for his next train and thought, if I do get pushed under the hurtling wheels, I hope it's in the morning, because what a terrible waste to be killed on the way back from work. Then the red train burst out of the dark arse of the creamy tiled wall with a great scream. Listing, round the bend of the platform, slowed, grunted, stopped, sighed, relaxed. Oh, stop it. We find out that Winkler has this fear, like I say, of being pushed under a train, which is clearly like an attempt at foreshadowing for what we've already been told will happen, where he pushes someone else under a train. Is it really foreshadowing if we've just been told flat out? I don't know. I thought Giles was attempting some sort of, like, attempt at irony here of, like, ooh, look, he became the thing he feared, but having read the whole book, no. But again, I feel like there's something that could have been interesting to explore here. Intrusive thoughts, you know, that thought of, like, someone's in front of you, and you're like, I could push them now. That kind of intrusive thought that, I mean, we don't all get that thought, but we all do get intrusive thoughts, and we're like, ooh, how do we deal with them? Where did that come from? What does that say about me? That's something interesting that could be good to explore. And also this obsessive worrying about unlikely events, like falling or being pushed under a train. That is something that would have been really interesting to look at in more detail. But again, it's not well executed in this book. It's never explored further, and the way it is portrayed is such a cringy, etchy way, I just can't deal with it. Everything we know about the character of Winkler up to this point, I said, made him so flat yet so unlikable, and I think that is the best summary for his character throughout this entire book. It was for this reason, this lack of confidence in his survival strategy, that Winkler always stood at the very end of the platform, by the opening where the train would arrive. That way there was no question of pain. At the other end of the platform, anywhere past the middle probably, the train would have slowed down enough that immediate death was uncertain. He might be slammed down into the well between the tracks, mashing dozens of major bones and suffering terrible brain damage that would leave him drooling and slurring and pissing himself in public, or maybe lose a leg, or be chewed up down one side. All of which had happened to Cornelius Prane from school. Winkler shuddered again, just thinking of him. Cornelius Prane had lost an eye and an arm, and the use of a leg jumping to escape his teenage friendlessness, virginity, wonky chin, mathematical genius, and not actually carved in stone certainty of university entrance success, and fucked it. And he was now a fully grown, friendless virgin who had not after all gone to university, and was fully fucked in more ways than he would have dared to dream of back in the day when he thought the lack of a fuck and a place at Cambridge was the worst life could throw at a man. I guess this is meant to maybe show where his fear comes from. I don't know. This Cornelius is never mentioned again. Not once. So what's the point? And so, at the gaping entry point, the train was still bombing down at pretty much full pelt. If the baddies went for him here, or his self-slaughter-curious demons got the better of him, a swift end was guaranteed. The hammer of God would not flinch. At this point, I was kind of just hoping the train would hit him and the book would end. And we're only on chapter 2. Now, don't get me wrong, I do not mind a book where nothing much happens and it's more of a character study and about character development and growth and that sort of thing. Like, I would say that Alan Sillitoe's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning is a wonderful book, probably one of my favourites that I've read, and that's a fantastic example of a book where nothing much happens, but it's still so gripping and so interesting because there's so much character development. And also, Sillitoe doesn't necessarily create likeable characters, quite the opposite in fact. His protagonist, Arthur, I want to say, it's a long time since I read it, is very, very unlikable. He has a lot of flaws. He is a very flawed, rough, selfish character. But he's so rich and layered, and there is so much to him. And more than that, Sillitoe creates this really beautiful world where it's, 1950s working class Nottingham. It's so rich and textured and full of the boldest, most interesting characters. You get so engrossed in it all. They have these really distinct voices and big personalities, and you're like reading and reading to be like, oh, what happens next? Oh, what are they going to say? How are they going to react to that? It's less about the plot and this happens, this happens, this happens, and more of like, oh, what are they going to react to that? And what if they see that? And what, that sort of thing, You don't get that in this book. Instead, we just have a chugging train, the world's least tense cricket match, and now an irrational fear of an unlikely event that we know has already happened once and will happen again. It all feels very flat in comparison. Just give me a bit of grit, I don't want a chugging train. I want, because the underground is a very big, loud, noisy place. There's a lot going on. It is sensory overload. I have to wear my earplugs a lot when I'm on the underground. But I want you to write a description that captures that ear-shattering noise, Tell me about the sweat dripping down your neck as the aircon's broken and more people pile on a train. Make me feel claustrophobic in that enclosed little capsule with you, Tell me about the people on the train, the woman with the suitcase bigger than her, the dad struggling with a toddler in the middle of a tantrum, the tall woman in designer clothes who's trying not to panic because people are touching her. Tell me about the balding man with red cheeks and sweat patches on his jacket, I want to hear about these real rich characters and how they're reacting to each other and who they are and what happens when you take all these big bold characters and smoosh them together in one train carriage at the same time. And tell me about that little existential dread you get when you look around and realise that you're just a background character in each of their individual rich stories. That's the setting that I want for this, not a chugging train, Giles then spends several pages, and I mean several pages, listing different parts of the train platform and how safe they are in terms of is he going to be pushed under a train from here, and if he is, what he can do about it. For example, 1. The chocolate machine. Winkler had given this model a safety rating of 7 out of 10. It was of the very newest type, a large colourful plastic unit mounted, crucially, on 2 wide stanchions. They were good and sturdy. He had kicked them plenty of times in different footwear, and he was satisfied that they were not hollow, or if hollow, then thick enough as made no odds one way or the other. He imagined them still standing in a grim post-Armageddon future in which a station had been ransacked and the chocolate machine pillaged and then stolen for fuel. 2 vast and trunkless legs of plastic in the nuclear desert. In an emergency, if he could not get a grip for any reason on the unit itself and found himself on the floor being sucked by some unknown force into the path of a train, he was confident that he could save himself by locking arms around the legs. I feel like this could have been a really interesting part, but I simply don't care enough about this character or his fear, and the way it's written leaves me bored, and it goes on for way too long. When I say this goes on for pages, I mean pages, and it's all just the same. It's not funny, it's not exciting, it's just there. This is then followed by more incredibly offensive comments, and Winkler debates whether he could use another person to anchor himself to the platform. For example, all he had to do was select a convenient lard arse, get over the revulsion he felt at the sight of fat people, a physical reaction almost as debilitating as his train problem. He told himself over and over that physical enormity was not necessarily an indicator of model lassitude, but it just didn't help, and then park himself behind one. An enormous Jew in a black pinstripe three-piece suit with a moist bubble of face beneath a round hat waddled onto the platform and rolled past him holding a thin, shabby briefcase and loudly crunching a bright green apple. Ooh, these descriptions are so edgy. I can't believe this was written by a 35-year-old man. And actually, how was this published? He then goes on to describe the train in a similar way to how my 10-year-old nephew might. The train's blazing eyes, so dragon-like, flashed into view in the tunnel. Goes on to describe the man before, who he is now standing near, as the large Hebrew stood, flayed caught in one chubby fist, shabby case clutched greedily in the other, and watched the train hurtle in, watching also a roll of neck fat filthily grimed in the crease, and a dangle of curly black hair in front of the ear, which was not very clean, in the cartilaginous space behind it. In fact, inspected closely, it sustained a population of fetid blackheads. It's just a lot of words for the sake of it. They don't add anything. He's just trying to make himself sound clever by using big words that aren't necessarily appropriate, or they don't really add value in these situations, you know? And I just feel like in general with these descriptions, he's trying to be gross and shocking for the sake of it, and I just don't think there's any need for that, you know? Anyway, Winkler gets on the train, end of chapter. Once again, nothing happened. We learnt nothing about the character that's of any importance. What was the point of any of this? Chapter 3 is titled The Puddle, and at this point Giles unironically uses the frame blam twice in 2 pages. And I had to ask myself, why am I torturing myself like this? It gets worse though. These 2 blams are the first of, I think it's something like 44 blams in the book. That doesn't include the blamities he uses. There's a lot of blamity blams. A blam here, a blam there, a blamity blam here, a blamity blam blam blam. I'm not even joking. This is how he writes. The point of the second blam is to emphasize the shock of the train coming out of, like, when you're on the train and it comes out of the underground bit into the overground bit and suddenly there's like a whole bunch of natural light. I can think of at least 100 better ways he could have described this than just blam. Giles also chooses to say, he usually felt like shouting bomb, as if someone had detonated a light grenade in the carriage and everyone should throw themselves on the floor and cover their eyes. Should you do both at the same time, Winkler asked himself, or would that mean that you hurt your chin? But people did not throw themselves on the floor, for Winkler did not cry bomb. Now, if that sounds insensitive, it is, especially given when it was written. This book was written and published in 2005, which was when the 7/7 bombings happened in London on the London buses and London Underground. And as an individual who was there in London on that day, in the centre of London, while the bombs were going off, it was terrifying. It was horrifying to be there. It's my first time in London as well, and yeah, I'm kind of lucky it didn't scar me a bit. But I don't think that jokes like this, which were written at the exact time those terrorist attacks were happening, are in the best taste. People died, and shouting bomb on a piece of public transport that had recently been bombed isn't a funny joke, in my opinion. He then goes on to describe the area around the Docklands as screaming in the sun like the Emerald City, except not green. Can someone please take his keyboard away from him? He's really proud of this description though, because he uses it again just 2 paragraphs later when he tells us, up ahead, the Emerald City steamed in the sun. Steaming and screaming Emerald City. Yeah, a grown man really wrote that. I know. There's then a several-page long description, I wish I was joking, of a puddle outside of a train station which never quite dries up. Pages. Multiple pages about a puddle which is never significant. The puddle, which back in March was 8 inches deep at the centre and 3 or 4 feet in diameter, so that he had to jump out from the bottom step to keep his feet dry, had dwindled to little more than a saucerful at the converging point of 4 dirty yellow paving stones, the watered kind that pass secret information to blind people. Yeah, I absolutely do not care. Giles' not-so-secret food snob side of himself comes out when his main character passes a chip shop and he writes, "A shitty name for a shitty shop selling F knows what grey inedibles to greasy, needy morons who don't know any better," which was not made any better or worse by having been shattered by a brick on the left-hand side so that the two light strips behind the red plastic were exposed, making it unclear which qualities the establishment's portions of chickens and fish were supposed to possess. Use some full stops, please. This is so hard to read. He then, Winkler, Giles, then assumes, I can't even speak, that the shop must be run by immigrants, and he tries to decipher if the damage to the shop was done by a sloppy drunk, a racist drunk, or just a racist. I'll put this passage on screen, but I'm not going to read it out because it is filled with slurs. This chapter is chock full of racism. I think this is the most racist chapter in the book, and that's saying something. It is full of really uncomfortable phrases, like this one in which Winkler watches a young man for a while and says, "This one he was looking at now lost interest in him, pulled in his head and accelerated with a roar of rusty exhaust towards a brown 4-story housing estate that sprawled ahead of them to Winkler's right, full of, what? Pakistanis? Or was it Bengalis? Or Bangladeshis? Or were Bangladeshis the same as Bengalis? Not that it matters," thought Winkler, stepping towards the curb. No, it does matter. It matters a lot. He'd find out one day soon. The slim length of the street he was about to cross was the same slim length of the street on which, in the 1930s, the Jews rose up and fought the evil fascists. And the whole city rose with them. Glorious days. No Hitler for us. Did our fascists have a point, though? Come on. I'm not saying, Winkler wasn't saying anything, just thinking. I'm not saying anyone wants to gas anybody, but wasn't it all a bit like, and then now with the, and wouldn't it all have been, no, of course, no. What the hell is this nonsense? Why am I reading this? Why did I pay $2.99 for this? Did he just nearly defend Hitler and fascists? I have so many regrets in my life, and I have to say that reading this book has gone right to the top of the list. There's then more thinly veiled racism. One of the things I really love about London, and one of the reasons I used to love living there, is that it really is this big multicultural melting pot where you have so many amazing people from so many different backgrounds all coming together. And it's this big celebration of all these different cultures, and it's wonderful. Like, I lived in Lewisham, and the area that I lived in was a predominantly black area. And there was this amazing little food market there that had the most amazing food. Like, I have never had better plantain chips than I've had there. They were so good. One of my favourite food stalls was run by some people from Ghana. It was, amazing. Loved it so much. But there was just so much variety. You could get all these different foods from all these different places around the world, and it was all authentic because all these people had, like, come together in one place, and it was just this big, beautiful celebration of everyone. It was amazing. Anyway, Giles doesn't feel this way about London, apparently, and his self-insert main character seems so disgusted by people of other cultures living together that it's just really uncomfortable to read. So he sees a little old man and wonders where he might be going, and he writes, "After the post office, the greengrocer. Not a white face to be seen in there. Not ever." Winkler used to go in occasionally to see what would happen, pick up a funny-looking vegetable and stand there with it at the counter, anticipating suspicion, waiting to not understand whatever the Asian man behind the till said to him and to mumble sorry and run out of the shop all the way to work. But the man only ever said, "Yes, mate, £1.50, anything else?" Like a proper London accent, you know. And so it was no fun. The shop smelt of cumin, fenugreek, soft old fruit, armpits, and boxes. It brought flashing back with frightening efficiency shops he had been in Cairo, Nairobi, Goa, Zanzibar, Hammamet, always ducking very briefly off the package tour crocodile to slip through a beaded doorway. Then those shops made him feel adventurous, self-reliant, competent, happy, and free. This shop, despite the authenticity of its smell, which was helped very much by the heat, made him feel none of those things. Should it? Not necessarily, no. Should the shop even be here, with its warm reek of foreign holidays? Of course. Of course it should. I feel like if you have to stop and think and even convince yourself a little bit that people should exist and own businesses, then maybe that's something you need to work on. Those little unconscious racist biases, like expecting people of other races or immigrants to not speak English through lines like waiting to not understand whatever the Asian man behind the till said, like, they're things that I get that past generations might have felt. Like, I think to be honest, someone like my dad who's in like his mid-70s, yeah, he probably might look at people with a racist and be like, oh, you're gonna speak English? And so I feel like if you were writing the scene back in the 70s or 80s or whatever, then it would be a fair point to make. But at this point, this character is living in 2005. And this is a man only like, what, 20 years older than me? I think it would be one thing to show older generations having this view and then to critically analyse it and critique it and, you know, use it in fiction as a jumping off point to examine these unconscious racist biases. That would be interesting. But instead, we just have a racist character who continues to be racist, never learns that his racism is wrong, and is just treated like racism is normal, acceptable, never questioned. It's very uncomfortable. Giles Coren is clearly trying to write these as like humorous, relatable moments, when really they're not humorous and they're not relatable, and these are moments that we should all be horrified by. Then there's more body shaming. Here's another screenshot because I don't want to read out this. And another half-hearted attempt to stop using racial slurs. Again, screenshot, I don't want to read this out. Which is completely undone with some horrific Islamophobia on the next page. I can't believe I'm even having to read this stuff aloud. I can't believe this stuff is for sale on Amazon, actually. This is bad. Get ready for this. Wait, what's this? It's a sturdy little thing dressed all in black. But all, head to foot, with a little black cowl and a little black mask. It could be Batman for all Winkler knows. Apart from being barely able to walk, it's so fat, let alone fly. Mind you, Batman couldn't fly either, nor did he show his toes. Oh no, you want to know about modesty? Look at Batman. Batman is a Muslim woman who knows her place. Not like this one, whoring her fat little toes to all and sundry. Look, Winkler can see her toes. Oh, stone me to death for adultery, I saw her nasty little toes. Oh wait, to be fair, nice little toes. This reminded Winkler that he had more than one option when it came to thinking about this woman. It was no good just seeing things and then thinking the first thing that came into his head. There was a multitude of available thought options. Again, how did this get published? It gets worse. So his multitude of thought options include, but are not limited to, what is England coming to? It's not her fault. The bigoted patriarchal system of her own community forces her into this humiliating disguise, but she leads her own intellectual life inside the hateful wrappings as a life as valid as mine. Also, what is so individual about the shell-shoot, blocked-heeled slingbacks and greasy perm of the universal fag-smoking white trash fat bitch on which our nation depends for its longevity? I'm just going to jump in here with like a little aside as well, before Americans get mad. Fag means cigarette. That's just what it is. It is an entirely different word to the F slur. Sometimes different words have the same spelling and sound. These words are called homonyms. Same spelling, same pronunciation, but different words. And the word it is depends on the context and the meaning. So, for example, bear and bear, bow, and bow, you know? All different words, even though they sound the same. So, fag meaning cigarette and the F slur are different words. I'm happy to say the word for cigarette. I would never say the slur against gay people. Simple as that. Anyway, Winkler goes on with more sexist and repellent thoughts about this Muslim woman, and I can't help but feel like these are Giles' thoughts and not the characters. But again, these include the men who make her dress like this and who believe that Western women who show off their mottled pink flesh and wear makeup and stunt bras to imitate women made of plastic they see on television are whores, don't they have a point? If they're gonna come and live here and bring up their families and sow bloodlines, then shouldn't they make the cultural compromises that integration demands, by which Winkler meant eat, dress, talk, think, wipe your arse like us, respect the same values, if you disrespect them, then disrespect them like us, and how you pray and whom to and when and how often and whether you do it at all is up to you, and you will of course stop praying in time because the freedom to not pray always results in people not praying. And finally he comes to, these people, whoever they are, have every right to preserve their traditions, culture, whatever, in a way they choose, as long as it does not infringe on the civil liberties of others. By others in this context we mean us, rather than saying they're women, which of course raises the point that it is the very liberality and tolerance of the host culture that enshrines their right to practice their own bigotry if they choose to, and this leads you back in a way to thought option 1, which is too little too late, and the whole thing was just wholly unnecessary, wasn't it? Yeah, all of that was unnecessary. Now, the whole issue around women wearing hijabs and burqas and any kind of covering that they want to is a complex and nuanced one. It is difficult. I'm not going to go into it in this video, even though I have a lot of thoughts on it. There are some women who say they find freedom in it. There are some women who say that it is a help to them because it helps them have some degree of independence in a world that would otherwise take even more rights from them. But then again, for some people it is still purely a symbol of control and oppression, and it's hard. It's very complicated and difficult, and there's a lot of nuance to it. I don't think Giles captures the nuance here. He's clearly trying to be like, well, look, I'm looking at both sides of the argument, but really he's been like, am I going to be this kind of bigot or this kind of bigot? He thoroughly insults all women, whether they choose to cover up or not, calling them whores and bitches and so on. It just... it's horrific. I hate this bit. Again, how is this published? Winkler finally arrives at work, and that is it. End of the chapter. I did have to ask at this point, did Giles Coren have an editor on this? Because if so, what were they doing? Chapter 4 is titled The Office, and at this point I guessed what was going to happen in this chapter. I said, let me guess what's coming up here. He hates all his co-workers, they're stupider than him, why is he wasting his life in this job, oh woe is him, blah blah blah, pity pity pity, he goes home. Let's see how right I was. So his first description of the office is something. I'm a big Doctor Who fan, and this didn't even make me giggle. Left through the grubby white double doors with shatterproof portholes and walked down the ramp that would come in useful if the office ever decided to hire a disabled person or a Dalek. I don't find it funny. Winkler always used a ramp instead of the 3 steps. It made a nice cheap hollow sound when he walked on it. Our main character Winkler never remembers names of most of his colleagues, which I think is meant to be a commentary on ha ha ha, mindless office drones, but instead just comes across as making Winkler look like a self-obsessed person who cares about no one but himself, which he is. He describes them as things like the shiny-faced one with the beard on the media desk and the one whose name after 3 years Winkler still never remembered. So you know how a lot of books that have like self-insert characters have this subtle way of being like, ooh, the main character's so special and different and not like the other girls and guys and meh meh meh. You know, like how in like Twilight, for example, Bella is very clearly like a bit of a self-insert and she's special and she's not like the other girls. And this is made really apparent in books like Midnight Sun, written from Edward's perspective, where he says things like, normal human girls wouldn't raise their faces to the drizzle that way. Normal human girls wore makeup, even here in this wet place. Bella never wore makeup, nor would she. The cosmetics industry made billions of dollars a year from women who were trying to attain skin like hers. It's very like, oh, Bella's not like the other girl, she's more special. But it doesn't outright say it. It implies it, but it's still there, it's pretty obvious. Giles doesn't hint at this with his character of Winkler. Instead, he just straight up tells us Winkler is better than everyone else. What he really wanted to do was to remind them that he, Winkler, came and went as he pleased because he, unlike them, was not paid to occupy desk space and perform tasks in an endlessly repeated pattern hour after hour, day after day, week after week. He was paid to perform under pressure and to be unique. He was paid to be Winkler. He wanted to remind them that he was special, different, better than them. Seriously, how is this worse than Twilight? How is this less subtle than Twilight? How is this more not like the other girls than Twilight? And Winkler's not even a girl. Winkler then looks down on all his colleagues just as I expected, because they measured life in terms of lunches, nights, weekends, jobs, fuck-ups, and all of them broken down by size. And big only ever meant before, during, or after which a lot of alcohol was drunk. Their spiritual poverty corrupted even the concept of quantity. And he goes on to mock other colleagues because of their desks. He literally goes around the office and like lists and describes everyone's desk and mocks them because of it. It's ridiculous. Everything on a desk spoke to Winkler, sometimes even sang. He glanced as he walked at fat Marjorie's desk and the polka dotting of its post-it notes. I want you to think my mind works so fast and unconventionally, it warbled, that I have to scribble little monuments to my thoughts as I go, or they'll be lost forever. But the truth is my short-term memory is shot to pieces because I'm getting old. A framed photo of a baby muttered sadly, "This is my only achievement, my life is over." This feels less like creating an interesting tableau of characters and people and a office life in general, and more like just mocking people for the sake of it. It feels unnecessarily cruel. And this goes on for well over a page. He just goes by like desk, 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 desk. It's boring. When a colleague makes a joke to Winkler about his shirt being ironed for once, he thinks to himself, get ready because there's some homophobia in here. No, I haven't got a job interview, you sad fat little fairy with your mauve shirt and your purple horizontal striped metallic finish tie. I don't have a job interview because I already earned 3 times what you do for the same effing job because I'm so effing good at it, and they know it, and you should know that sitting next to me. I've never had a job interview in my life, twat, because people come to me and beg me to work for them, you oily little peasler. If I did have a job interview, I wouldn't specifically iron my shirt for it because I, unlike you and every other sorry-ass mother effer in this place, have more to sell myself on than my neat appearance, discretion, conformity, and ability to exactly fill the space left by the last bloke without anyone getting wiser that a change has been made. Now F off, you little toad, and let me get on with the business of being me, Winkler, who doesn't give an F. Why? I'm still shocked that they call this character the hero of the book. Are we actually meant to like him, to root for him? Because I don't, and I won't, and this is thoroughly making me dislike Giles Coren too, because I feel like this is how he thinks about himself in relation to his colleagues as well. Just the vibe I'm getting, you know? So far in this book, we've had some racism, we've had plenty of sexism, the homophobia wasn't going to be too far behind, you know? This is swiftly followed by the passage, Glorb, who is one of the colleagues, Glorb was everyone's favourite office. He made jokes about being gay so that everyone else could feel comfortable doing so too. But what thought Winkler about his dignity? Again, as a little aside here, I think it's really worth pointing out the difference in words like queer, you know? Queer is a word which has been thoroughly reclaimed by the LGBTQ+ community, and if people want to describe themselves in their communities as queer, a queer person, a queer community, if we use it as a term of celebration, then I think that's a wonderful thing, but that's not what Giles is doing here. He's using it as a slur, and I don't think that's okay, which is why I'm going to beep that out. Again, same word, different meaning, context matters. Oh god, and then there's this like whole plot point that just did not need to be here, where basically Winkler wants to go to the toilet for a number 2, and he wants something to read while he's there, and we get far too much information about this, and he's given a porn magazine to take with him that is gay porn, and then a whole bunch of stuff happens. It's too much information. I don't need to hear any of this. It didn't need to be in the book. It doesn't add anything. I just want it to stop. I do. I hate it. He comes back. There's more misogyny, more objectification of women. It's so disgusting. Winkler decides in the middle of the day he's going to go to the pub. 3 pints of thin, sour Guinness and a dark pub under a bridge put Winkler briefly in a more optimistic mood. The sun at least brought girls out. Walking back to the office, he kept trying to watch bouncing breasts in sleeveless white blouses, as well as arses and even occasional legs that weren't so bad go by. The legs were rarely any good though, because the girls were all secretaries at best, and while working class girls often have nice fat tits, they never have decent legs, too long in the thigh bone and too short in the calf. The great thing was that they all wore sunglasses, which rendered their facial shortcomings at least ambiguous. Fat tits, bleached hair, and shades. You couldn't ask for more. Winkler walked behind one of them all the way back to the office, coming back from her low-fat sandwich and bottled water lunch. He enjoyed for at least 100 yards the waistband of her G-string, which arched above the rim of her low-slung skirt into the flesh gap below the cropped blouse, and he fingered the mild beginnings of a hard-on through his trouser pocket. Other girls passed him, and he looked at them too. With 3 pints of beer in him, he half felt like f***ing them all. Can we please start a petition to never let Giles Coren on the street or around women ever again? It gets worse too. He then considers sexually assaulting a woman. Arriving at the office, he stepped in front of the one he had been following to hold the door open with an outstretched arm, and she said thank you. He considered pushing his pelvis out a little as she walked past him, so that her G-strung hip would brush his but he decided in that tiny portion of a second against it. Oh, how lovely of him to decide not to assault her. I get that not every character in a book has to be likeable and nice, but there's a difference between an author writing a character who is purposely awful and this, which is an author writing what they think is a hero with all these witty and edgy thoughts and feelings and meh, who is actually just an awful person. Back in the office, Winkler tries to drunkenly hit on a woman because, yeah, he's literally been drinking in the middle of a workday. He gets turned down, he goes home. End of chapter. Waste of all our times. I would say my prediction for that chapter was fairly accurate. Chapter 5. This is titled The Smell. I didn't have high hopes for this one based on the title alone, and I was right. So the opening paragraph seems to be relying on shock value more than anything else. I did not get the point. The smell of the house came skipping to meet Winkler every evening like a dog yapping and wagging its tail. It was the smell of boiled head. Recently boiled, the scummed water just cooling off the simmer with a great fuss of meaty steam. Specifically the head of a man, Winkler thought. Some others said it was the head of a woman, and Winkler was certain the head was old. The smell was worst at the first floor landing, where it was sticky in the carpet and in the velvet of the 6 little lampshades on the wall lamps, and in the tassels of the table lamp that stood over the phone. And the lace table cover the telephone stood on was yellow with the smell too. This all really reads like a teenager trying to be edgy. Ooh, there's a bad smell, it must be a boiled head. Just shut up. The thing is, this plot point of the boiled head smell is not important at all. We do find out what the smell is later on, but none of it adds anything to the plot. So the fact that there is all of this time, there are pages spent on this smell, there's no need for it. No need. There are more attempts at describing the smell pervading every inch of the building. I feel like Giles was trying to go for like almost a horror type of vibe with this to make the odor seem invasive and unavoidable, but it just falls flat and it's just a bit like, that's a bit gross. Okay. He then goes on to describe some of the people who live in the building with him. Basically, it's like a big house and they all rent a different room and share the kitchen and living room and that sort of thing. There were 3 doors. One with 2 glass panels led to the dark basement stairs. Behind each of the other 2 lived an old person who had been in the house for years. 50 years, supposedly, if you want to believe that. The room that faced you as you walked down the corridor contained a man. Immediately left as you left his flat, though nobody ever did, was the other door behind which lived a woman. Neither seemed to notice the smell. There's more of this. He doesn't really know any of his neighbours, he doesn't know their names, except one other couple who he's friends with, but he doesn't know anything about anyone he lives with. And this reads like it was written by a man who has never paid attention to another person in his life. And then he's suddenly being asked to describe the people around him, and he's like, well, there's a man, and he's old, and that's all he can come up with. To draw the comparison again to Alan Silito's Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, I think what's apparent in his writing is that Alan absolutely loves what he does. You know, he's not writing in the self-indulgent way, but he loves capturing real life and creating this world that is a great reflection of the world he sees around us. You know, he likes he likes capturing everyday life and real people and making them come alive on the page. Like he wrote in so basically Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, he wrote in the 50s about the 50s, and then in 1979 he wrote about that novel. He said, "I had no theme in my head except the joy of writing. The sweat of writing clearly and truthfully, the work of trying to portray ordinary people as I knew them and in such a way that they would recognise themselves. This took me a long time to achieve and was more difficult than one might imagine." That is something I can't imagine Giles Coren ever saying about his own work and writing. The scene here with the smell and the neighbours is the first time we see Winkler at home with the people he lives, and I want to compare this to the first scene we get of Arthur at home with his parents in Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. What's happened in that book is Arthur has been out the night before and got ridiculously drunk, as he often does, nearly started a fight, as he often does, and he's gone off to sleep with a married woman whose husband is off working a night shift, as he often does. He is kicked out of the house the next morning as the husband comes home. The husband's none the wiser, but, you know, Arthur runs out and he's hungover and he gets to his parents' house where he lives. And now Arthur isn't a nice guy. He's irresponsible, he's selfish, he's got the world's biggest ego, but he's also very, very real. He is a pretty typical young working-class northern guy in the 50s. He's 22 and he already thinks he knows everything and can have anything he wants. You know, he's got that arrogance that makes him very raw and real. And he does get some degree of comeuppance and learns something to some extent throughout the book, but I think there's a great introduction to him in the scene with his dad that it just sets up his character so well, and it's right at the start of the book, and it tells us so much of what we need to know about Arthur and his life in general. His father cut several slices of bread and made sandwiches with cold meat left from Sunday dinner. Arthur teased him a lot, but in a way he was glad to see the TV standing in the corner of the living room, a glossy panelled box looking, he thought, like something plundered from a spaceship. The old man was happy at last anyway, and he deserved to be happy. After all the years before the war on the dole, 5 kids and the big miserying that went with no money and no way of getting any. And now he had a sit-down job at the factory, all the woodbines he could smoke, money for a pint if he wanted one, though he didn't as a rule drink, a holiday somewhere, a jaunt on the firm's trip to Blackpool, and a television set to look into at home. The difference between before the war and after the war didn't bear thinking about. War was a marvellous thing in many ways when you thought about how happy it made so many people in England. There's no flies on me, Arthur thought. And this description is just, it's great, it's so real, and it's so much richer than anything Giles has ever written or will write, especially in his book Winkler. In this book by Alan Sillitoe, we get to see those small little bits of real life that made up the day-to-day living for many, Northerners in the 50s, the cold meat sandwiches, the marvel of having a TV in your living room that was rare and exciting back then. And then, of course, we get Arthur giving his thoughts on the war, something he never experienced, never bothered to actually learn about, and he comes across almost like as offensively naive, Both Arthur and Winkler, in their respective books, are ignorant. We can't deny that. But Giles doesn't necessarily seem aware of his character's ignorance, and it ends up expressed as cynicism and anger and racism, whereas Alan, comparatively, is very aware of his character Arthur's ignorance and quite literally wants the reader to have a little bit of a giggle at his expense. Even plenty of other characters literally call Arthur out for his behaviour at several points throughout the book, even in the very beginning when they're just establishing his character. Winkler's ignorance is never really pointed out. A couple of times people are like, oh, you've been a hypocrite, but that's it. It never really goes far enough. Also, sorry if I sound a bit funny and sniffly today, but I've got quite a bit of a cold, and I'm doing okay at the minute. I've taken cold and flu tablets. I'm talking, I'm fine. My sore throat's at bay, but I'm a bit, I'm coming out the other side of the cold. I'm doing all right. I'll be fine by tomorrow, but I just need to get some filming done, that's all. Then, despite how much we've seen Giles love his embedded clauses and brackets, here he decides to mix both of them and use neither properly. He literally opens a bracket and then just never closes it again. Leaves it open by accident. Again, was there not an editor on this book? How did no one spot this? Will, one of the housemates and Winkler's pretty much only friend, Will swore he could smell it from the pavement, putting his hand on the mossy gate to push it open. Dry, dusty moss in the summer, wet moss like cold mucus in the winter. Looking up the house, it's late Victorian red brick, it's ivy, it's 14 dirty windows, the small cracked paving squares through the wild front garden to the blue door with the orange, red and green stained glass and the number 32, he swore he could smell it. Then, full stop, no closing brackets. How did he not pick this up? I could forgive it in a self-published book, but in this, that had an actual publisher, there's even more of this boiled head nonsense, and Giles attempts to give one of the other many people that Winkler lives with and his girlfriend an accent. Apparently it's an Irish accent. It took me a while to figure that out. Now, I have spoken about dialects in writing many times before, and I'm a big fan of it when it's done well. I think it creates a really rich, unique voice and a lot of work, and there are so many people who do it really well. One of my favourite ever poets, who sadly died just last December, Benjamin Zephaniah, bless him, he used to do it all the time. He would, in his poetry, capture his beautiful mix of Birmingham and Jamaican dialects and accents in his work, and it makes all of his poems have such a distinct and unique voice that is so completely him, and it's beautiful. I love it. Alan Sillitoe does it a lot in his novels, showing off that proper northern accent. Simon Armitage captures the Yorkshire accent a lot in his poetry, which is what I grew up with, and a lot of dropping vowels and missing out whole syllables and stuff. That's how a lot of us speak up north, and sometimes people pick it up in my videos a little bit, but I've lost a lot of that accent now, but it's still really nice to read it in literature and poetry. So things like, instead of pronouncing water, we say water. You miss that whole consonant out there, just water. Instead of saying you're going to go to the shops, you say I'm going to go to shops. Missing out whole syllables in there. Whole syllables. Bottle becomes bottle. In Saturday night and Sunday morning, Alan Sillitoe isn't afraid to use common phrases like saying someone's badly instead of ill, saying how it's nippy out instead of cold, things like that. There's different accents and different ways. In good writing, it all feels very natural. It all flows together naturally. It isn't overused. It just adds a little bit of richness and depth to the text and kind of gives it a context and places it, you know, saying, hey, this is where the setting is. These are who these people are. But it doesn't detract from the rest of the writing. You don't want to be stopping and saying, wait, what is this word? And like kind of, you know, as though you're reading like Old or Middle English or something like that. You don't want it to come across like that. That's how it is in Giles's work. He does not do it well at all. It is distracting. It's written like someone who is mocking someone's accent instead of trying to give someone a natural voice. And of course, he over-explains it all. So you get passages like this. So this is about, I think, Mary, who is Winkler's girlfriend. She believed, like the rest of them, that human flesh was being boiled, but Mary talks about it the most, pronouncing cooking as kukin and bitch as batch. He chopped her up into tiny pieces and he kept her in that fucking great freezer in the kitchen. He's cooking the batch into fucking soup so as the bastard police'll never find her. I think it's supposed to be an Irish accent, but that's not how it comes across with this spelling. I was just trying to read the spelling rather than do an Irish accent, okay? Your accent makes it sound like some sort of super violent Ulster cookery show, Will said, misjudging Mary as he always misjudged her. You know, sort of like Tarantino meets Gary Rhodes meets, I don't know, Henry Kelly. Henry Kelly is from Cork, you fucking arsehole. Jesus Christ, Wink. I've had a long day, will you tell him to shut up? It makes it hard to read. It doesn't add depth, it's just hard. Now, we only find out that she's his partner/girlfriend because we're told Mary lived in Winkler's room, in Winkler's bed. In Winkler. She was squat, tough, and noisy. Lovely. And bear in mind, this man Winkler was literally hitting on one of his colleagues just 3 pages earlier while drunk, like an hour earlier in this book's timeline, and he considered assaulting a stranger on the street just like 10 minutes before that, so clearly he's loyal. Then, apparently because Mary is Irish and this is 2005, this means she has never seen a real black person before. Then there's a bit more racism that I do not want to read out. I can't deal with this book. It ends once again with Winkler denying that he's Jewish, so that's fun. Then the chapter ends with Winkler remembering a time that Mary was awful to him during oral sex because she realised he was circumcised and that might make him Jewish. It's very odd, frankly unrealistic. Like, I know circumcision is fairly rare here in the UK compared to, say, like America, but it's not some big, shocking, scary thing. I don't think anyone's ever been like, oh my god, you're circumcised, No one does that. No one's disgusted by it, no one's shocked by it, it's just like, oh, okay. I just find Mary's reaction incredibly unbelievable, and also if someone mocks your penis, why would you keep seeing them? I don't know, very odd. A lot of this is unrealistic. It's interesting because, like, a lot of Jewish people do still face intolerances and anti-Semitism, but the way those are portrayed in this book are so cartoonish and over the top and outlandish, it makes it seem unreal and unrealistic. So I don't know, it's odd. Anyway, next chapter. Okay, at this point it's getting a little late and my throat is getting a little sore, so I'm going to take a break and carry on filming this tomorrow. So I will look different, but I will see you then. Right, hi, hello everyone, and welcome back. This has probably been a whole 3 seconds for you, but for me, I've had so much drama go on. Let me crack some caffeine and I will tell you about it if you're interested. If not, feel free to skip forward to whatever time is on screen right now. So I took my break the other day, rested my voice a little bit, got all my video files on the computer, came to film the next day, and my camera had stopped working. Just being an absolute nightmare. I don't really know what it was doing. It's some issue with the shutter. It started doing it a couple of, like maybe a week and a half ago, I think, when me and my friend Joe took Kara to the forest. The shutter started playing up. I thought maybe it was just the camera being cold and struggling outside in chilly temperatures, but no, it started doing it while I was trying to film, and I filmed something like a total of like half an hour's worth of footage, and none of it saved to the SD card and everything was messing up, and I was just very upset and very stressed. So I was like, do I try and get this repaired? But then that's going to take weeks, and there were just like a whole bunch of other issues with it. I was like, oh, or I could buy a new camera, and in the end I've bought a new camera because, and people are really nice. when I told you guys about this. But people were like, yeah, you know, it's fine, you could film on your phone for all weekend. I was like, that's really lovely of you to say, but that's not all I have to think about, because I've got a sponsor that I need to film a video for who are not going to be okay with me filming on my phone with like absolute crap audio, and I've got a bunch of gigs coming up that I'm shooting that I need a camera for, because like it's not like you can do that on your iPhone. And it's just, yeah, I was stressed, but it's okay, we got it sorted. We have the new camera now. It actually arrived in time, everything is fine. It has taken a chunk out of my savings, but it's okay, because that's what savings are there for, right? And I am very, very grateful that I'm at a point in my life where I actually have them now, because like last time I had an emergency, last time my old camera broke 5 years ago, I was screwed, and Dan, who I'd just broken up with, actually had to buy my old camera for me, and I paid him back over however many months. When my computer broke randomly a few years back, I had to crowdfund that. It was a nightmare, so I am very, very grateful that I did have the savings there to get through this emergency. So we're okay, we've got it, we're sorted, we're getting through this, we've got the camera back. Let's jump back into this video, and we're on to chapter 6 now, and God's sake, I can't believe I have to say this. This chapter is no joke, titled The Old Jew Who Lived Under the Stairs. I know. Right, it's my third time trying to record this bit, so now I've got a working camera, let's do it. Later, after screwing Mary under the grim white strip light of the attic bedroom, Winkler rolled off her onto his back and threw his arm over his eyes to keep out the glare. Ooh, the romance. Make it stop. Where do I find a man like this? Just everything about this feels icky, right? Not a fan. Winkler was embarrassed by his exhaustion and by the noise of it. Any minute now she might say, well, Jesus Christ. Again, this is Giles's attempt at writing an Irish accent. As you can tell, it doesn't come out good. Words are hard right now. I don't know what you've got to be so fucking exhausted about. I mean, get a little bit better than he was doing before, we'll give him that. He pulled the wetted pillow out from under his neck and used it to prop his sweaty chest so that he could lean into it without having to think about staying on his side, and reached out with his right arm so that his finger pads bridged on the cool wall. A lot of words for a lot of nothing. With his head flat on the lumpy mattress, his breathing felt quieter, but he could hear his heart more loudly thumping against the flax. That was nice, Mary said. That's not a compliment, is it? So because they live in a dodgy house, the electricity goes out and Winkler has to go down to the basement to like flick some switch on. And on the way down, he has like a whole bunch of thoughts about stuff. Mostly it's just him being horrible about his housemates and supposed friends, but yeah. So he calls his only friend Will, he calls his girlfriend his mousy, titless girlfriend. There's just no need for it, is there? It's just gross. It's objectifying for the sake of it. I don't like it. And then he tells us that his friend Will is alright, but not in a useful way. How does this guy even have friends? And then he goes back to the girlfriend and says that she is merely kind, but the world wouldn't miss her if she was hit by a bus. God's sake. Why am I reading this book? There is nothing enjoyable or entertaining about any of this drivel. There's just not. So Winkler keeps heading downstairs. This all takes far too many pages for nothing actually happening. He stands on a hair clip at one point. He maybe stands on a beetle. And then in the least tense attempt at a tense scene ever, we get what you need, said a long pointy nose sliding out from behind the door nearest the cellar entrance, lit by a moonbeam, and dangling like a lantern, a drop of mucus, is a candle. There's a man there, that's all. It's a man who comes out to see if he's alright. So this man's like, mate, come on in, I'll give you a candle, then you could go down to the basement and fix the lights, and you'll actually be able to, like, see your way and stuff. Because remember, this was 2005, alright? I guess mobile phones with the big light-up screens and torches were not common. Yeah, no, 2005, like, I didn't know any phone that had a torch on it. Anyway, so Winkler is shocked that this man that he's never spoken to or paid any attention to actually knows his name and seems to care about him to some extent. You know, I mean, like, how crazy is this? Not everyone in the world is as self-absorbed as Winkler and therefore Giles Coren. Shocking. This man has a bunch of photos scattered around his room, and Winkler is like, people and looks at the pictures, and then suddenly he's like, oh wait, I recognize this guy, not because they've been living in the same building for God knows how many years, but because, flashback, and then we get a flashback scene. In October of the year before last, Winkler had ducked into the sad, dirty Payless Minute Mart on the high street up the hill for tea or deodorant or cigarettes, and annoyed as ever at being filtered up and down 2 hours of food to get to the till, he had almost tuttered as he was called upon to avoid in a hurry a crooked old man whom he could now identify as this crooked old man hobbling with a stick very slowly along the rows of cakes and biscuits. Giles, you do know that not every paragraph has to be just one sentence, right? You can split them up. It's allowed. Wondering if you've got enough change to buy the Mr. Kipling French fancies instead of the Povo brand jam tarts past the sell-by date, are you, old man? Winkler had thought, slowing down to be revolted by the liver spots on the parts of the man's head that were not covered by a damp deer stalker. But he'd become immediately sad entertaining the thought, immediately full of self-loathing. Winkler suddenly felt sick with pity for the man's life outside the cakes. The pity sickness was real and creased his stomach as efficiently as ever love sickness had. It was like this because all he knew about the man was his cake-selecting deliberateness, and so all he could make of his life had to be built on it, and because he was old and bent, it all had to be sad and lonely. And this had to be the highlight. Here he was, witnessing the man's attempt to find happiness in his last days with plastic-wrapped processed sweet matter. He felt like crying, and only didn't cry because if he cried about crap like this, then where would it end? All this because the man's taking some time to pick out his biscuits. I take time to pick out my biscuits. Does that mean people see me in Tesco and like, oh, pity this woman and her sad life because she's taken her time with her biscuits? Ridiculous. So then we get back to the present day and, you sure you won't have a drink? Perhaps a cup of tea? Wallenstein, the man is called Wallenstein, by the way. Wallenstein asked, now as if he'd already asked once. No, I'm fine really. I've got to go and do that fuse. My girlfriend will be. Winkler wondered if it was wrong to introduce into this lonely old person's death chamber the idea of extramarital cohabitation. Wondering where I am. Wrong to conjure the image in this cold place of Mary's still flushed and sticky body sprawled naked on the mattress upstairs. Oh, for God's sake, enough of this pity, please, and I hate this use of brackets. I see what Giles was going for, it just doesn't work. None of it flows well, you know? Giles is a poor writer, which is ridiculous for someone who makes their living writing. When he's not doing this, he's writing news articles and editorial things and reviews and I don't know, I'm just saying words now, but he writes for a living, that's the point. So this old guy, Wallenstein, says that he never uses electricity in the house because the landlord is dodgy as hell and is actually like hooked up some wiring stuff so the electricity bypasses the meter and he's essentially stealing electricity from the national grid. And it's dangerous, said Wallenstein, and also wrong. To steal is to steal. I told him I would have nothing to do with it. So at this point I was like, great, I like this guy. He's like the first person in this book that seems to have some morals. He stands by them. I like that. Great, a decent guy. But no. Then there's this weird discussion in which it feels like Giles is attempting to be all like philosophical and deep, and but it all falls flat because it's just so poorly written and thought out. So when Wallenstein didn't want the illegal electricity, the landlord said that he'd kill him. He like threatened him, right? Seems over the top, but here we are. And Wallenstein is like, well, screw that, I'm going to the police anyway. The police didn't do anything, but Winkler is like, if you thought he'd kill you, why report him? Oh my god, and he's so shocked. And then Wallenstein says this wall of text, that, like I say, is Giles' attempt at being like deep and philosophical and trying to make you think about these things, but it just doesn't work. So what should I care if he kills me? Such a death I don't fear. I am an old man. He comes to me with such a hammer or a brick, I don't know what he imagines, and bang, he strikes me here. The old man slapped the side of his forehead with a hard palm, and so I am dead immediately. This I am not afraid of. And anyway, he wouldn't have killed you, would he? Said Winkler. So I don't see... Wouldn't have killed me, you think? Wallenstein said in a raised voice. Why not to kill me? Why not to kill me? Oh my God. Why not to kill me? You think because a man is adult that he will not suddenly kill a man for reasons of his own? You think because Mulligan has not murdered before? Ha! Or so you imagine, that he will not start now? You think a murderer is such a one kind of person and a not murderer is something else? You know to tell me who will kill who? From what do you know how to judge? From what do you know how to judge this? Yeah, from what do you know how to judge this? This is so poorly written. such a threatener is always harmless, you think, and maybe it's so. But if you have made these threats yourself, and then with your own hands you have killed them, then you know to believe a man is best when he says he will kill you, and then it is easier not to be afraid of it. It's not such a big thing to be killed. You should kill somebody yourself one day. Then you see what I mean. It is not so much to be afraid of. There you are, and then pop. There is the end of it. It's not so much of a thing. I feel like this could have been an interesting topic, or an interesting area to discuss at least, maybe a little bit, but it just feels like jumbled ramblings. It's just not good. It's hard to read, it's hard to understand. There really isn't, when you dig into it, anything of any substance there. It's just bad. I did feel like at this point Giles Coren was trying to create a book similar to something along the lines of like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, where, here it is, where, you know, you only have this kind of like very vague plot point with lots of complex and often unlikable characters who are being used through their actions and their dialogue, who are being used to deliver this discussion of bigger topics relating to existence and ethics and religion and everything you can think of, basically. Now, I have mixed feelings about this book, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. On the one hand, there were some interesting bits in it. I've got a couple of little highlights here and there of bits that I found kind of interesting and stuff, you know? It did get me thinking. I thought on the whole it was very well written. It definitely wasn't the jumbled mess that Giles Coren's book is. So I felt like it had a lot of potential, but on the other hand, I couldn't tell if this was just pretentious drivel for people who wanted to feel intellectual and deep, or if it actually had something to say. And I still haven't decided. I think I need to read it again at least once or twice before I make up my mind. But what I will say is that at least Milan Kundera is competent in their writing and creates a book that you actually at least want to finish and read. And at least they make points that are succinct and thoughtful without all the muddy rambling. That can't be said of Giles Coren. But I do think this is kind of what he was going for. He just doesn't have the skill or the intelligence to pull it off. And now I say that out loud, that sounds very mean. Yeah. So Winkler realises that this man, Wallenstein, is from Eastern Europe as he starts to talk about the person or people he killed in the past. I am not joking with you. This was in another country and this was terrible times. Another aged Mr. Winkler. He calls him Winkler. Everybody from there is dead now, if they survived or if they did not survive. So it doesn't matter now, did they survive or did they perish? You see, Mr. Winkler, for what I did, I am sorry, but I'm also glad, because after the killing, then for 50 years everything was easy. It was in the camps, yes, and it was out of the camps. It was everywhere killing. So, your candle is guttering and it will go out soon. You don't want to hear me on about killing people in another world. Winkler did and did not want to hear. He wanted it over with for the most part because it was clear now that he was going to have to hear it at some point. This old man had some fantasy of the war he wanted to tell Winkler about, or whoever happened to be around, presumably. All old people want to witter on about stuff from when they were young, and Winkler was probably lucky this stuff wasn't just about wooden toys and milk carts pulled by donkeys. I'm gonna be honest, I feel like Winkler's perspective of, well, if you're going to witter on about something, at least it's the Holocaust and not something happy, is probably not the most respectful way to discuss this topic in general. But anyway, Winkler's like, it's late, I need to fix the dodgy electrics, tell me tomorrow, and then the chapter ends. So we are 35% of the way through this book so far, and all we have is an unlikable man who we keep being told is our hero, but who we don't really see do anything heroic and whose personality changes up every 5 pages. But ultimately his defining characteristics are that he is selfish, mean, he hides his Jewish ancestry for reasons which are unclear, and that is about it. Then he meets a man who suffered during the Holocaust, and at this point I was like, let me guess what's going to happen, even though we've kind of already been told. He's going to listen to his story and suddenly stop being so ashamed of his history and realise how good and easy he has life now compared to others. And with some luck, this will stop him being so judgmental of everyone else. And by judgmental, I mean racist, homophobic and sexist. But we'll see. Looking back now, I was too optimistic. I know. But I said, if this is the case, if this is what happens, it's a story which is a little cliched and has been done before, but which could still be very powerful and important if it's told in a thoughtful way. It's not told in a thoughtful way. If you would like to read some actually good books that cover topics around the Holocaust and, you know, the suffering of Jews at that time and everything like that, a couple of recommendations I have include Art Spiegelman's Mouse, which is a wonderful, wonderful graphic novel, very, very emotional, beautiful, wonderful, love it, thoroughly recommend. Ellie Weisel, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Their memoir Night is great. Possibly one of the more popular ones is Mark Zuzak's The Book Thief, which again, it's kind of popular, it's mainstream, but it's good, it's a great read. And then what I also had on this list was, I read it years ago now, so I don't remember it too well, but I remember being very moved by Jodi Picoult's The Storyteller, although her novels can often verge into kind of like over-sentimentality and being a bit dramatic, so take that recommendation with a pinch of salt, but I remember enjoying it at the time, but I wouldn't say it's as good as the others. But there you go. Couple of recommendations for you. Chapter 7. This one is titled Grandpa. Okay, so this chapter opens with our fourth of approximately 40-something blams in this book. I've already shown you how many there are, it is ridiculous. Apparently Winkler goes through his day again, it's exactly the same as the day before, except he's even more self-absorbed than before, because his night was no one's business but theirs. He couldn't be bothered with this. He had an old Jewish killer in the cellar of his flesh-smelly spook house up north. He had depths in his life of which these effing cattle knew nothing. Yeah, let's not make the experience of a Holocaust survivor all about you, yeah? Just a thought. Also at this point I was starting to get a little confused with the book because so far there have been 3 not very fleshed out women and they all have very, very similar names. So I kept having to flick back and double check which was which. You've got Mandy, Mary and Muriel. So I was like, wait, which M is this? Whose girlfriend is this? Is this someone? And then I realised actually it doesn't even matter. Or does Giles just like to insert random women to be sexual towards in random places of the book and then forget they ever exist? Yes. Yes, he does. Anyway, at the office, Winkler gets a phone call from his granddad who complains that he doesn't phone him enough, and Winkler's like, oh, my life is so boring. I just come into the office surrounded by these morons and then go home to my fat girlfriend who I keep calling names every night, and meh, 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 meh. And yeah, he literally calls her fat. It's just, it's unnecessary, you know? We then learn that usually when his granddad calls him to chat, he feels like smashing up his phone. So at this point we know that Winkler is a well-adjusted, calm man with no anger issues at all. I have no pity for him. God's sake, this is so hard to read. Winkler, unusually, did not feel at all at this moment like smashing the telephone unit to splinters with the handset and tearing his hands up a bit along the way, which he sometimes did during these sorts of conversations, because he knew the sight of his own blood running down his forearm would shock him into calming down. This type of conversation was pretty much a routine for him and usually ended with his own blood dripping onto something clean. It's unnecessary. There's some more objectification of women and homophobia, which is just part of the course at this point. Like, it's so expected it's hardly worth pointing out anymore. It does, however, seem that Winkler's laziness is starting to catch up with him because his boss wants to see him, and Winkler considers that he may be getting fired, to which his thought process is, oh, this is bad because... Winkler glimpsed briefly a world where he was in complete control, not shackled to the office, not excusing himself to the Knuths for being different from, come on, better than them, not forcibly moulding his natural romantic recklessness into something resembling a work ethic, so that at least he had some sort of tangible scale by which to measure his success or failures as a human. Deprived of a spiritually decrepit arena in which to take moral centre stage and a population of midgets by comparison with whom he could not help but appear a giant, he would be forced to grasp life by the throat and shake it into something commensurate with his capacity to dream. It was only a shame that he had to depend on his employers making the terrible mistake of firing him to catalyse this assault on Olympus. The bourgeois dilemma that set short-term comfort against eternal reward, the stifling smother of option paralysis made it impossible for him to take the first step onto the road to self-definition. But if someone pushed him, if someone pulled the chocks and gave him a nudge, then once he was rolling, this is just literally unbearable to read. It's so poorly written, and he's such a little douchebag, and not in the like, oh, you love to hate him kind of way, just in the please will you shut up kind of way. Like, I'm sorry, but I have no sympathy for him. He would rather die, really, rather leap in front of that effing train and have done with it than grovel for an extension apply himself to the work now. He couldn't, simply couldn't, flick through page after page of drivel trying to make sense of it, and then set his mind to the creation of something the company was meant to believe was the best he could do. The irony that that's what I've been doing while reviewing this book, it's not lost on me. But seriously, does Giles want us to like feel sorry for Winkler here, or what? I mean, we might be cheering for his downfall a little bit, but the enjoyment of seeing his downfall is undercut by all his whining, you know? I just cannot deal with people like this, and I just kind of want to shake the book and say, stop being lazy! But he never does. So Winkler is nearly forced into doing some actual work, and it's like this big drama, and he's like an edgy child about this whole thing, and they have him like swearing in his passwords for the work computer and using insults as file names. It's just, oh, God's sake, it is unbearable. It's so bad. It's so stupid. Oh, God's sake. He takes a break from doing no work to contemplate the Holocaust in possibly one of the most insensitive ways. He sees this Victorian industrial estate from his window, and he's looking out across all the buildings, and he says, looming above it all was the giant chimney of unknown purpose, which could be seen for miles around. Winkler saw this morning for the first time how the chimney resembled what he imagined the chimneys of Auschwitz ovens had looked like, visible from across the plains of Poland, belching satisfied fumes of roasted Jew into the clouds, to rain down on Europe for years afterwards. Not this one, of course, which was smokeless. You can't go around incinerating Jews nowadays. You can't even smoke. But wait, where did the gassing come in? Did they burn them or gas them? Did they gas them and then burn them? Wasn't that a waste of gas, and time, and manpower? Why not just chuck them in the ovens alive? I know. Can we please just all agree to make a rule here where people stop trying to be edgy about the Holocaust? Winkler then gets back to work, and I feel like all of this could have easily been left out. We could have had none of this chapter, and the book would be 10 times better. He created a file entitled Work 21 to indicate the day's date. He wrote his name on the first page. Who does that? He wrote his name on the first page. Then he wrote a prefatory sentence and got up to go to the loo. When he got back, he read what he had written. Nobody is pretending that Werther 2001 has turned out the way we all expected. Winkler stared at the ceiling. Finally, he returned his gaze to the computer screen and wrote, but then who the F are we to know anything? And why should we give an F what happens to a project intended to provide gratification only for 3 or 4 greedy mother effers whom I would like to see eaten by hogs from the inwards? He chuckled to himself. Then he opened all the files and read what was in them. An unsent letter to Mandy gave him a hard-on, and he contemplated but that was sick. So he closed the file. When he'd read everything contained in the files, bits of poems he'd forgotten writing, long emails from tiresome people dumped for further perusal, unsent letters to newspapers, proposals for projects that was supposed to allow him to get out of this effing place and do something with his life, but had not got past the first page, he sat back and looked at the ceiling some more. Not even teenagers are this cringy, right? He then kills time until 3 p.m, he does nothing and leaves work, but not before being creepy about a woman again. Lovely. He goes back on his promise to visit his grandfather, and the chapter ends. There we go. What a waste of time. Chapter 8 is titled What Wallenstein Did in the War. So pages of absolutely nothing happen. Winkler goes home from work, he gets drunk, he falls asleep, he wakes up, he decides to go and have a nosy at other people's belongings in the cellar for unexplained reasons. I still don't know why he does that, but he does, and then he gets caught on his way down by Wallenstein. He makes up this nonsensical excuse about how he's lost his keys, and then he has to follow through with that. So the bit in the beginning where he was like, when he loses his keys, no, he never actually loses his keys. That's wrong. It's a lie that he lost his keys, but he hasn't lost his keys. And now Wallenstein invites him for a cup of tea, and Winkler says no, but Wallenstein's like, well, you have to, you've lost your keys. And Winkler's like, oh no, I guess I do have no keys. I'm locked out. But point is, Winkler has to go into his flat and listen to his story. I hate this book. Stonin'. Stonin'. I stole a girl. A gorgeous girl. Hey, gorgeous girl. I love you, buddy. Okay. You just need a bit of attention. It's okay. We all do sometimes. You cozy now? And say hello to everyone. Hello. Look at his gorgeous tummy. You're okay. You get comfy. There you go. So, point is, basically, they end up in Wallenstein's flat. And we get this exchange which could be interesting, but it isn't, is it? It's not. Forgive me for asking Mr. Winkler, but are you Jewish? Winkler replied, yes, which felt as much of a lie as when he replied no to the same question when asked by English people. It was a question to which he could not give a truthful answer. So again, this is like the only reoccurring plot point in the book that could be interesting, right? Winkler struggles with his Jewish identity. This is something that I would have liked to read about in a novel. I think it's interesting understanding where these feelings came from, how they affect his day-to-day life, how he overcomes them. That would be interesting, but while it's hinted at, none of that is actually explored in this book. There's a whole page of Wallenstein asking Winkler about his upbringing, what he knows, what he doesn't know about kind of like Jewish culture and traditions and generally being Jewish. You know, Winkler tries to answer, but he gets a lot of words mixed up. He doesn't know the proper terms for things. He hasn't had many traditional Jewish experiences. Like, you know, he's never had a bar mitzvah or anything like that. Again, this could have been interesting, but instead it feels like Giles is like, well, I have a Jewish family and I'm technically Jewish, so let me throw as many Jewish words as I can onto one page and then quickly move on. It feels rushed and without purpose, and like nothing interesting is actually explored. Does that make sense? Winkler then starts to talk about how everyone at his school made fun of Jewish people and even to some degree the Holocaust. Again, I wish this was explored a bit more. I feel like what Giles was trying to do with that first chapter with the cricket match was like set up this background of Winkler hiding his Jewishness from childhood, but it just didn't do that very well. And I wish that some of the things that are discussed here were actually shown in that first chapter instead of that cricket match. You know, like I want to know about how this bullying at school actually made this kid really feel, what pushed him towards hiding this huge part of himself, and how that kind of changed and grew as he got older, that internal struggle he continues to feel to this day. That would have been really, really interesting, more than just like a couple of throwaway lines of exposition, you know? Like the most we ever get is this story, which again is told and not shown, and it's just something that could have been interesting, but again isn't enough. But about the camps you were never told? Of course, at school, all the time. Except I didn't pay much attention because I just wished the teacher would shut up about it. Every time he said the word Jew, the classroom went funny, and they all made hook-nosed gestures with their fingers at me while the teacher was reading. It was a mistake doing modern history for O-level. I wanted to do medieval, but there was a test and I failed, so I got put on the modern course, which was basically the war. Winkler then tells the story of how kids at school would bully him by like piling up his belongings like on his bed at this, because it was a what's it called, you know, the posh schools, and they sleep there, boarding schools. It was a boarding school, there we go. So basically, yeah, the kids would like bully him and like get all his belongings together, like his shoes and stuff, and pile them up on his beds to make it look like the belongings of like a victim in a concentration camp, right? And this could be such a powerful, horrifying moment, but it falls flat because of the way that it's told and because of everything else in the book, and it just it's a waste of something that could have been interesting. Like, I want to see how that actually affected him as a kid. I want to see all that anger and upset. I want to see the emotions that come with such an awful, cruel joke. But instead, all we get is Winkler saying, well, it happened. And then, now if it happened, I'd go after whoever it was with a baseball bat. And how it wouldn't matter if he hit the wrong kids because they're all just Jew-hating psychos. And again, it just feels like this edgy teen with anger issues instead of someone with like an actual righteous anger towards a long-term injustice, you know? It feels like he's not doing this justice. Anyway, we move on from that very, very quickly, and now we get into Wallenstein's story. And this is what takes up most of the rest of the chapter. And now, having read the book, I have mixed thoughts. I'm very, very conflicted in all this, okay? Let me read you what I have of my script that I wrote as I was writing this, and then I'll decide if I want to give you spoilers or not. We'll we'll see. Okay, so Wallenstein tells this really heartbreaking story of how when he was younger, he was almost tricked into using soap made from the fat of Jewish people who died in concentration camps, right? And this is what I wrote, the first good part of the book. It is emotional, it's disturbing as it should be. The voice of the Polish woman who gave him this soap to use is hauntingly cold. I don't understand why it took us up to 40% of the way into this book to get a meaningful scene, but I'm glad we do get it. So this was good, I thought this was good. And then Wallenstein goes on to talk about more of his experiences and he tells us his stories, right? So Wallenstein talks about when he was just 16, Germany invaded Poland. He talks about losing his parents. He talks about his sister being killed by bombs. And all Winkler can do is ask about things like, but did you get to work on a tram? And he keeps like not listening to Wallenstein's story and like mistaking his sister for a brother he never had. And I feel like maybe the point is to show us how out of touch and self-absorbed Winkler is, but really it just makes the whole thing really difficult to read. The rest of Wallenstein's story again is the best part of the book, and I have few complaints about it other than it seems rushed and I wish more time had been spent on it. I think it could have been treated with a little more respect, but honestly, I'll take it at this point. And I kind of stand by that. You'll see why I'm upset about this when we get to the end of the video. Yeah. It is really, really frustrating though, because like every time you have a really good part of this chapter, it's ruined almost immediately. So Wallenstein is talking about how the rights of Jewish people were really slowly taken away, like bit by bit, so much that you didn't even realize how extreme it was getting. You know, things like first they closed the kosher butchers, and then they did this, and then this, and this. You know, Jews weren't allowed in the parks, and then this, and this. And Giles decides that this, which is a really important, meaningful bit of the story and conversation and history, Giles decides that this is a great time for Winkler to have a flashback to the time he had a woman touch his penis in a park to the point where he ejaculated into a duck pond. That is just inserted into the middle of this, and then Wallenstein goes right back to talking about how Jewish people were stopped from practicing law. It's jarring and not in a good way. I don't know what he was thinking when he wrote this and why he thought this would be a good idea. I feel like if I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt, I kind of get what Giles was trying to do, right? Two Jewish men from different generations, growing up in different places, having different experiences, but I think there's a better and more respectful way to show this than via a scene about ejaculating into a duck pond. And also, knowing what we know at the end of the book, there are better ways to do this than with these two characters. You'll see when we get there. You'll see. Wallenstein goes on to talk about things like the creation of ghettos, forced labour, again, all really heartbreaking stuff and very important stuff that I wish more time had been spent on in this book, but it's kind of rushed through, unfortunately. And again, it's all very poorly written, so God, it takes some getting through, to be honest. Again, Winkler's ignorance is shown a lot, and at this point I feel like it's intentional, right? But it's also unbearable to read. Like, I refuse to believe people like this actually exist. So being told about like the forced labour and stuff like that, this is Winkler's response. But if you kept your head down, thought Winkler, in the dark afternoon, in the room smelling of fish, then you were probably alright. And if you did what you were told and just kept working and didn't do anything bad, you'd be okay. The only thing was, how do you build a wall? Winkler had no idea. Would the Germans have explained this, or just expected him to get on with it? Do they have foundations? What if he'd said he didn't know how to build a wall? Would they have been okay? As long as he was trying his best and not being insolent, he spoke a little bit of German, so they might have favoured him a bit. And at the end of it, at least he would have known how to build a wall. I know I'm speaking about this as a obviously non-Jewish woman, so I'm not sure how much is my place to comment on this. But just as a human being, I don't get how a human can write things like this, writing as someone who's supposed to be a protagonist and what Giles calls a hero. How can he write this about the actual deaths of other humans? I don't know, I'm struggling a lot and I feel like I'm not expressing myself properly. I'm just so shocked by how bad this all is. On the one hand, I kind of get it, you know. I think Winkler's character is trying to find some sort of logic and compassion and like some humanity in something that was so dehumanizing and unlogical and just cruel. I get he's like, I kind of get that's what it's trying to show, but I'm struggling here. I'm really, really struggling here. So Wallenstein goes on to talk about more really, really horrible things that actually happened in history. You know, these aren't fictional. These are actual things that happened. Things like, you know, Wallenstein talks about the number of people he saw be killed in front of him. He talks about babies being killed. He talks about Nazis literally just like blindly shooting into crowds and stuff like that. And Winkler, again, just like is so cold to it all. He ignores a lot of this stuff. He gets distracted by other things, and it feels disrespectful, you know? Winkler, ever since the old man said underground, was thinking of nothing but tube stations and barely noticed. When he became aware of Wallenstein again, the old man was talking about less crowded times. I hate this. How is this character supposed to have any growth if he's not even listening? And even Wallenstein points out how uninterested and disrespectful, although he doesn't say that, Winkler is being. Winkler moved in his chair, stretched his legs, and moved his head exaggeratedly from side to side, and it made a crack loud enough to be heard by the old man, who looked up. But I bore you, Mr. Winkler, with my story. There is perhaps not action enough. It is only to tell you how it was before, and then there is no big surprises, because here, after all, I am. So horribly written. Wallenstein talks more about things like how he had to pretend for a while not to be Jewish, he had to hide away, and all Winkler can think of is himself again, with like, would I be able to pass as non-Jewish? And circumcised penises and circumcised penises. Why is that hard to say? And all stuff like that. Like, I wish I was joking. He spends so long just thinking about penises. He was not especially short, and his walk was fine and straight. His nose was relatively small and very straight. His ears were sleek and well-fitted. He did not gesticulate too much when he spoke, and he rarely suffered from sinus trouble. This was all thanks to mongrelization of the blood. He was a robust crossbreed rather than a frail thoroughbred. But then, of course, there was his... Goes back to Wallenstein's story. The daughter of this family was maybe 15, a year younger than I, and her name was Adriana. What about your penis? I'm sorry, Mr. Winkler? Your penis. You were obviously circumcised. Supposing they saw this. Wallenstein looked puzzled. I have said only that there was a daughter. It was not to produce suddenly my penis in the first meeting. I was 16, which in this time was a man in many ways that is not expected now of such a boy, but it was not all sex, sex, sex. This was not my thought when I'm sorry, Mr. Wallenstein, said Winkler. I didn't mean to suggest that at all. Winkler had not, in fact, heard anything of what Wallenstein said about the girl or her family, busy as he was contemplating his looks. I shouldn't have interrupted. I meant only, what if they suspected you and pulled your pants down? I mean, when I was at school, I pretended not to be a Jew and had to keep mine away from view. I never had a bath or shower at school in 11 years. I have no words. I have no words for any of this. It is the worst thing I've ever read. Wallenstein, though, has the best response to this. Interesting, said Wallenstein. What is so terrible for you if they should see it? In my situation, it would have been different. Not an embarrassment because suddenly my friends discover I'm a liar, but a death sentence immediate. Thank you. Then there are several pages talking about penises, and Wallenstein saying his circumcision had a complication which left him with a deformity, so he neither looked uncircumcised nor circumcised. Again, I thought this was unnecessary, but there's a stupid reason for it that we find out at the end of the book, for God's sake. So Wallenstein keeps talking about everyone around him dying, and Winkler keeps fantasizing about his teenage crushes. It's a lot, not in a good way. It's like, Wallenstein's here talking about, like, death and murders and genocide, and Winkler's just like, yeah, so when I was 15 there was this girl and she had breasts like whatever, and then there was another girl and she had breasts like whatever. It's the worst. What happens next is long-winded and rambly and confused and blah blah blah, but basically Wallenstein ends up having to kill a family, including a girl he loved, to save his own life and the lives of his friends and family, but it turns out it's too late and all his Jewish friends and family have died anyway. It's brutal, it's sad, the writing is unclear and meandering, but I'll kind of forgive it in this case because I feel like maybe that's how an emotional story from 60 years ago would be told. Except what we find out at the end of the book. God's sake, I'm so frustrated at this. I kind of just want to tell you what it is, but at the same time, no, you're coming on this journey with me. Winkler, of course, finds a way to make this all about him, and it's frustrating again. So first, Winkler himself gets upset because he imagines that this girl who had to be killed looks like his old crush, and then he's like, I'd like to go back and kill everyone who's currently living in that village because of the thing their ancestors did, or things that happened when they were very young children. And I understand anger towards horrific things like murder and genocide, but I also don't understand directing that anger at now innocent people who had nothing to do with it. It just feels unnecessary, and also it's just horribly written. There's a lot of blams in this. Winkler goes on about how he'd blam this and blam that and blamity blam them all. It just... Let's not avenge violence against innocent people with violence against other innocent people, yeah? They'd still be alive now, Winkler thought. Just not just the laughing children, but some of the men. Now would be the perfect time for Winkler to go back there. Just a tourist to the village and kill them. What a surprise they would get. What a joy to walk the streets of their little town with a machine gun, putting fat sprays of fire into the bellies of old effer after old effer. And how sweet after all this time. Better than hot blood. Better for 60 years to think you'd got away with it. And then one day on a cold morning, a tourist in a brightly coloured anorak pulls from his rucksack something black and shining, and blam blam blamity blam blam blam. Only how? Winkler had no idea how to fire a gun, or where to get one. I know. Wallenstein's story continues for several more pages. This is by far the best part of the book. I don't really have too much to say about it. But then Winkler shakes his hand and leaves. End of chapter, end of part 1 of the book. Now we're moving on to part 2 and chapter 9, what Winkler's flatmates thought about it. I'm not a fan of the chapter titles in this part of the book, I'll be honest. They are stupid. Winkler exits the flat and there is this dramatic shift in tone from Wallenstein's story to Mary coming home from work and swearing and shouting and just generally being loud and a bit obnoxious. And I think this shift in tone is intentional, but it just feels like a big step back in terms of the book's development, if I'm being honest. So I understand why he's doing it, I just don't think it works well, if that makes sense. There are ways you can show kind of tense juxtaposition between someone's awful memories and the mundanity of people's everyday lives now without it seeming like the author just doesn't know how to write. So Winkler tries to share with Mary what Wallenstein told him about the ghettos and this whole experience, and her response is, aye, all very interesting, I'm sure. I've seen some terrible too. Did you get anything for supper? I'm not sure if Giles is trying to make a point about people in society not caring for others, or if he just doesn't know how to write compassionate humans. But it turns out, literally no one in this book is compassionate at all. I'll tell you now, no one cares about the story. Apparently the Holocaust is a joke to every single person in the world, even Jewish people. No one cares about it. No one worries about the people who had to go through that. No one cares. It's all just a big inconvenience. It's unbelievable. Like, I don't think people behave like this in the real world. Like, not every single person out there. I don't know. Winkler's response is to think he wondered whether it was still such a good idea them all living together, and whether maybe it was a good time to say goodbye to Mary too, and in fact, probably to can his stupid job and go and live a long way away for a while, and hook up maybe with the sort of girl that was split open by Wallenstein, a nice foreign girl. Ugh, am I the only one who finds this distasteful? And then in another poorly executed attempt at showing people distancing themselves from tragedy, their friend/neighbour Will goes on a really long rant that says, bloody hell, there's been a massacre at a school in Wales. Loads of children killed. Sayonara to the Sprogs of the Valleys. It was about 3 o'clock. It was all hands on deck at the office, as you can imagine. Will worked on the diary of a national newspaper, one of 5 old Etonians who sat at a round desk in tweed jackets, writing about jolly goings-on at product launch parties and hoping one day to become editors, which they all would. And then, are you ready for the longest sentence in the book so far? This is going to be hard. Even us diarists were nearly involved, he went on, because Ed considered dropping the diary out of respect. 22 daisy pushes at the last count, but then we pointed out that you have to give the readers a bit of a chortle, even unto the darkest hour and all that, and he agreed, but there were loads of really grismal photos of these kids all mashed up. The killer took off some of their faces with a hunting knife before they shot him, and anyway, the designers did this graphic of where each child was killed in the school. Of course, most of it was speculative speculative because we don't have many details yet, but it'll be the best layout in the first editions, we reckon. And so Tufty, he's the news ed, he phoned down for a case of poo for after the edition had gone to celebrate doing the best splash in years, it says. And here Winkler's friend put up his stretched palm and wiped a banner headline in the air as he spoke, "Slaughter of the Innocents," and under it is a photograph of some body bags. In fact, they're corpses from Rwanda, as they haven't released actual real Welsh body bag pics yet, and nobody will notice because the bags are zipped shut and it's in a municipal building of some sort. It was really funny because Jane P., she's the pics ed, said that they never even got in the paper when they were just a row of bags of 4 little dead sea slurs, but now we're pretending it's white babies inside. They're on the front effing page. And then anyway, the grog was delivered and we tucked right in, and then Ed made a speech standing on a desk about how this was real journalism and stories like this were why we had gone into it in the first place. And then he announced that they were extending the print run, moving back the deadline on the last edition and going for 2 million copies, and we all cheered. And anyway, then I was allowed to come home because the diary was done. So even though it was all pretty exciting and some of the other chaps decided to hang around, I thought I'd take advantage of the tragic sitch and miss the worst of the traffic. That is all one sentence. Everything about it is terrible. And not just the writing style, just the content, I hate my life right now. Winkler wondered what to say. "That's all a bit sick, isn't it?" he said, although he was rarely bothered by lapses in taste, and was not much moved by this one across town if the officers of the newspaper he had never read. "Well, you can't bring them back by being sad, so you might as well just get on with it," said Will, "and it's our job to focus on the tragedy and stop it happening again." I really think Giles thinks he's making a profound point here. And you know, there probably is a point to be made, just not like this. Winkler shows his first bit of compassion, and Giles once again explains the obvious to the reader. "I mean, Christ, it's a bit effing sick, no? The effers kill children and they're all drinking champagne and celebrating about their effing diagrams. It's the reality of hard news," Will said slowly. "I'm sorry if you find it difficult to stomach. What civilians sometimes fail to..." Civilians? Look, you can sit there crying about it, that's all very well, but somebody has to make the attempt to describe and explain. And drink champagne? I think this is meant to show some sort of growth in Winkler, but it just feels too little too late, and when he regresses straight afterwards, it just all feels meaningless, you know? Winkler then goes on to try and tell Will about the Holocaust, but Will is all ignorant and misunderstands terms, and Winkler gets really angry about it, which is ironic considering he was literally just misunderstanding the same terms about an hour ago, but here we are, I guess. Then Winkler decides to just start throwing random insults around about a friend of Will for no reason. Again, this gets even more confusing for me because this friend comes back up later, and I don't understand the point in any of this. I do not understand the point. There are then 2 pages about why Winkler hates dancing, and it is an unbearable read about how he is just an insecure, petulant child. And then again, he decides to make someone else's story of surviving the Holocaust all about himself, and in the process, insults everyone by being homophobic and sexist and just an awful person. Now, Winkler had nothing to do. His social default options, Mary and Will, were simultaneously unavailable. Where did they say they were going? Didn't he and Mary have plans? Wasn't Will his best mate? Winkler needed to talk about this Wallenstein thing, this Holocaust thing, this Jew thing, this Winkler thing. He'd been looking forward to talking about it. And yet, clearly, they weren't interested. More interested in their own turdy little lives. Will off to wherever with his tosser, gay boy Eton friends. No doubt they'd end up dancing with each other. Mary truffing snortily in some cheapo pork hole with those bog-trotting slappers Sheena and Kate. The 3 of them so richly Irish, their DNA profile differed by only 1% from that of a medium-sized baking potato. Winkler didn't need crap bags like that around. Yeah, I don't blame anyone for not wanting to be around him when he speaks about him like that. And then there's this whole passage that I don't even know how to comment on how messed up this all is. "I haven't done crap," said Winkler aloud, "but he'd nearly pushed a fat man under a train yesterday. A Jew even. Wrong choice. He touched the garments and bums of random women and thought about pushing them under the train. Better. And then just now, downstairs, he thought about going all the way to Germany, Poland, wherever, and pushing them under trains and trams. Stupid, and all just thinking. I haven't actually done anything. Not ever. If he really did push someone under a train, though, if he really did, that would be something now, wouldn't it? Imagine, paff, all over. Some fat housewife splats, and Winkler is made more than mortal. Why fat? Because it leads at least a sliver of rationality in it. Fat people are gross. Moral lassitude is all it is. A failure to apply the normal moral restraints to actions is what makes fat effers fat. To that extent, they are no different from murderers, rapists, paedophiles, and the more widely reviled sociopaths. I know, are you hearing this? It gets worse. Do they explode when the train hits them, or what? Do you see it all, or does the locomotive rush them away from you in the moment of dying? And what about killing a good-looking slim woman? The sun warmed Winkler's lap. 1 minute she's standing there reading the paper. The train hurtles in, she looks up, feels a firm shove on her bum, thinks it's just routine pervery, same as always, but it isn't. Not this time. Pointless though. She'll never know it was him, never know anything. She'd have no idea of his power. Wallenstein shot the young German girl, the 14-year-old girl the Russian wanted to rape. She would have been slender, slightly tanned, cornflower eyes, wearing a peasant sort of smock thing, no doubt. Physically confident beyond her years from all that rustic living, a little bit dirty, fleck of mud on her forehead. Winkler slipped his hand into his shorts, cupped his balls, yanked the waistband down with the back of his wrist. The door opened and Mariel walked in. Winkler was stunned. F, he said, and immediately he didn't know which was worse, that his delicate, slender, strawberry blonde flatmate had seen his penis, or that his had been spoiled. Once again, how was this published? He was about to masturbate over a 14-year-old girl who'd been murdered, and Deciding to review this book is one of the low points in my life. If I'd known it was going to be this bad, I wouldn't have even come near it. Winkler then decides to start flirting with Mariel, his best friend's girlfriend. I say flirting, it's just a bunch of references to the famous five and some penis jokes. Lines like, and then he felt the swelling of his balls again, just from tricking Mariel into talking about his penis. This man is a predator, and you cannot convince me otherwise. They drink a bit of wine together. He starts to imagine trying to seduce her, which includes the line, they might accidentally look at each other, kiss, and then wamola. The step from kiss to in her mouth was a very short one among friends. The kiss was the barrier. Past that, and intimacy is accepted. God, I wish I didn't know how to read. After this, there's a lot of creepy stuff about her body. I do not like it. Thankfully, though, none of that happens. Mariel is too smart, and she's like, nah, mate, I'm off to my mum and dad's for tea. Bye! And then the chapter ends. Chapter 10. What people on the tube thought about it. Right, let's get through this. Come on. Winkler has a bunch of dreams, or maybe nightmares, about the Holocaust. Mary doesn't come home from a night out with friends. While unable to get back to sleep, Giles attempts to write some deep thoughts, but just makes Winkler seem even more ignorant and shallow than ever. It's all relative, Winkler thought, lying there, not sleeping, thinking of Wallenstein's heart and how it must have raced when Izzy's brother didn't want to let him in the truck. Good days and bad days. Emotions are only how you respond to experience, and their extremes are guided only by what you know. Winkler's miseries were suffered as painfully as Wallenstein's, as anyone's who suffered in the Holocaust. He was as unhappy as any Jew has ever been. This is actually preceded by a line about how even in Auschwitz there was some sort of happiness. Again, how was this published? And this isn't deep. This is just insensitive and messed up, right? Winkler gets on his way to work a bit earlier than usual, and he judges everyone around him again. This time though, he targets a man who is missing an arm, and a drunk person, and probably some homeless people. These judgments include lines like, at the bottom of the escalator by the wall lay 3 drunks, unconscious, with their dirty faces flush on the filthy floor, clutching polystyrene cups empty of coppers. The human volume was thicker flowing at the bottom, and wound out in space-seeking tentacles to fill all the gaps and crevices. They had to step over the bodies of the tramps. There was no other way. Winkler carries on his train journey and is shocked by how many people are blindly obedient, by which he just means they follow instructions on signs meant to help them. Like, seriously, signs there for their safety and convenience, like standing behind a yellow line when the train approaches and using stairs when the escalator's broken. I wouldn't call that blind obedience. I would say that is just following rules to keep you safe, but whatever, I guess. you know? I guess Giles wanted to try and throw in some commentary about sheeple and day-to-day life and even if it doesn't actually make any sense. Winkler then mocks people for eating while they travel, tries to buy food of his own, but the vending machine doesn't work, so he steals a chalk ice from a child. I wish I was making this up. But no, this stuff actually happens. Searching the walls for an exit, Winkler saw the boy with the chalk ice again. He reached out and grabbed the food from the boy's tiny hand and in an instant crammed it in his mouth, tearing the remaining wrappings from it as he pushed it in. The chocolate was thick and sickly and so full of sugar that he could feel the grains of it jostling in the gooey mouthful. The boy stopped, stunned, and stared at his empty hand, but his mother was already dragging him away into the crowd as he started to cry. So Winkler didn't hear the screaming begin, and if he could not hear the screaming, he would probably survive the guilt. What the hell is wrong with Giles for writing any of this? What am I doing with my life? What am I doing with my life? I feel like a lot of the time Giles is just writing some of this stuff for the sake of things happening in the book. Was he high when he wrote this? How much coke had he snorted before vomiting this nonsense onto the page? That's what I want to know. Winkler himself is acting like a paranoid mess who is getting angry with everyone all the time. 2 or 3 tutted as he passed, and Winkler stood on tiptoe to turn back and shout over surprised heads, "Yeah, what? Effing what? Effing tut at me, you..." Seeing a vacant seat, he drove hard through the mass, and arriving just ahead of a crooked old man with huge ears and a bald yellow head spattered with liver spots, smartly pressed old brown suit, and big, thick, square reactolite, probably post-cataract glasses. Flopped into it heavily. God, the sentences! They are so hard to read. He was stared at disapprovingly but silently. The old man clung shakily to a chrome pole as the train took off. "What are you muttering about?" Winkler said randomly to a woman next to him, who immediately looked down at her newspaper. Winkler stared around the carriage, his eyes slashing wildly from side to side like a torchbeam looking for something in a forest, fixing people with his eyes who would meet his stare bravely, momentarily, and then look away. He looked at the old man standing, about Wallenstein's age, but not Jewish, very possibly German, and thought, who knows what this bastard did in the war. Winkler then displays more racism and is like, "I don't care if these immigrants stab me, blah 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 blah," and then suddenly he's at work and the chapter ends. What a waste of all our time. At this point you might be thinking that I'm missing out some key pieces of the plot or the narrative or whatever it is, like that connect these events and make it all more cohesive and make sense and have this underlying story, but no, they really are just things happening and happening and happening with nothing to really join them or make sense of it all. There's no point to any of it. I know! Chapter 11 is what the Office thought about it. So by this point you probably realise what Giles is trying and failing to do. The first part of this book is Winkler's regular life and his apathy towards everything, and then he hears this harrowing story and this part of him is being changed by it and being shocked at everyone else's apathy towards it, even though he also had apathy towards it when he was being told it, and yeah. These few chapters here I think are meant to be about showing the same events from the first part but with a new perspective. Except it doesn't work, because his whole reaction to learning about the Holocaust is a self-centered one, and even now he's judgmental, and if anything, he's just worse behaved than he was in the first part of the book. It's not character growth, it's just he feels more justified in his bad behaviour now, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, Winkler gets into the office that day and there's a freelancer sat at his desk, and Winkler spends 2 pages saying awful things about him. I do find it interesting how Giles writes this next section without a hint of irony, considering this is how Giles himself writes. Malcolm Pritchard spoke in slow, muddy, murderous torrents of words that dried up occasionally in the flow, the gaps to be filled with winks and nods and laughs while he gathered his tongue for further action. If you tried to speak in this slow trickle of oral fudge, then whatever you said reminded him of something that he too had seen, done, or experienced that was considerably more authentic, amusing, and archetypal. He introduced many of his exploits as archetypal, saying, "This was the stuff of pure archetype," as if to emphasize that it was he, in this modern age, who had set the experimental paradigms for poor imitators such as Winkler to hopelessly pursue. Winkler was physically sickened by every word, wink, and ear waggle of it. When Pritchard spoke at him, Winkler treated the passing moments as time that could be spent arranging in his mind things that needed doing over the next few days. It's funny that Winkler criticizes this in Malcolm when this is exactly what he does to other people. And it's ironic that Giles complains about people speaking in slow, muddy torrents of words of blah 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 when this is literally how he writes. Anyway, then there's a bunch of transphobic and sexist jokes. I'm sick of it at this point. There's another page and another passing mention of oral sex and a little bit more racism thrown in there. Lovely. 2 more pages talking about circumcision again, because Giles is obsessed with it for some reason, and therefore Winkler's obsessed with it as well. You'd think that comes back as like some sort of payoff, but no. No, Winkler just likes to think about penises a lot. That's it. Then there's a bit kind of slightly criticising circumcision in general, but not because it's the mutilation of a baby without their consent, but because circumcised men didn't get as much pleasure from blowjobs because of the permanent exposure of the glands. That's the worst thing they can think, like the worst consequence they can come up with of circumcision. Now this kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit, because in quite a few videos recently I have spoken about the problems associated with female genital mutilation, and a lot of people there were like, yes, but what about male genital mutilation? That is just as bad. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but no. Objectively, it's not as bad. I still don't agree with male circumcision, especially on babies and children without their consent. I thoroughly believe that if a person wants to be circumcised for religious reasons, they should be allowed to do it once they are old enough to consent to it. But even then, I don't think it is as bad as female cutting. Just objectively, it is not. Circumcision has a tiny percentage of complications associated with it compared to FGM. Male circumcision is usually, nearly always, done in clean conditions with minimal pain, and the child that it's done to is almost always too young to even remember it being done to them. Of course that raises problems with consent, but in general it's not emotionally scarring for the child. And when you ask people like, oh, what are the long-term consequences of circumcision, the biggest one that comes up is like a slight lack of pleasure. But even then, this doesn't affect all circumcised men. Some people even say it increases pleasure, it increases cleanliness. There's lots of people saying it's a good thing. FGM, on the other hand, is always bad and never has any positive consequences. FGM is nearly always done in unsanitary conditions with a child who is aware of what is happening but is unable to consent to it, and it does result in a lot of emotional scarring and damage and trauma. Most cutting results in infections which go untreated, and almost every single person who has been cut suffers a long-term consequence of it, whether that is death, pain during urination, pain during sex, an inability to have sex at all, being unable to give birth properly leading to her or her baby dying during childbirth, or being severely injured, and far more. I go into a lot of detail in my other videos on FGM. I'd recommend watching my video on Lauren Chen and my other video on intersectional feminism, which is titled something like, I'm not a feminist or something, I don't know. I express myself better there than I'm doing here. I'm a little rambly today. I'm still getting over this cold. Brain fog is a bitch. I'm struggling. When people are like, oh, but like male circumcision is just as bad as FGM, the point that I brought up in like the comments on Instagram was like, it's like this. Imagine 2 people get hit by a car, and one of them comes out of it with a grazed elbow, and the other is lying unconscious with a bleed on the brain and could die. Both of them have been wronged. Both of them have had something bad done to them. Neither deserve to be hit by the car, and the driver of the car deserves consequences for hitting them. Absolutely. We can be angry that the car hit both of them, but we also have to recognise that the consequences for one of them are far more severe than the consequences for the other. And when it comes to treating them, one of them needs more immediate care than the other. That's the difference. Graze on the elbow is male circumcision. Bleed on the brain and likely to die is FGM. Anyway, okay, rant aside. Winkler decides to tell his colleagues about Wallenstein and the Holocaust, and the colleague that we met in the first part of the book, Glob, is pretty dismissive, but mostly in the wait, didn't you already know this stuff sort of way, until he ends up saying, I can't believe I'm going to read this, Mengel Schmengel, every bloody Holocaust survivor. He raised 2 pairs of twitching rabbit ears to indicate inverted commas before the H and R, claims he met Mengel. Mengel is always there in the bloody story somewhere. It's so disrespectful, right? Even writing a character that's meant to be disrespectful, it comes across as disrespectful because it feels almost like cartoonish in a way. Like there are more realistic and better ways to show a person having maybe like some apathy or lack of care for a big tragedy than this. I don't know. Anyway, Winkler brings everything back to himself again with the line, I think survivors often don't talk about it. Maybe he finally decided to before he died, and maybe I was the only one possible. I just felt I really ought to sit there and listen for him. He's talking about Wallenstein. He's like, oh, I did such a good thing listening to him, blah, 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 blah. Then there's another kind of cartoonish hate for the Holocaust, this time from the other guy, Malcolm, who says, "Oh Christ save us," muttered Pritchard Lowe. "Not another Holocaust bore." Holocaust bore? Holocaust bore? Jesus from you? How dare you be bothered by the Holocaust? How dare you? And how, Jesus, dare you call anybody, anyone, or anything on the face of God's earth boring? You of all people, you. Oh, God, I have thoughts here. I don't think anyone actually talks this way, but I mean, yeah, if people actually told Jewish people talking about the Holocaust that they were being Holocaust bores, then yeah, I think Winkler's reply would be justified, but the whole thing feels unrealistic. I don't know. I feel like my mind is so numb at this point, I'm struggling to articulate how this book makes me feel. Anyway, Winkler continues ranting, and he justifies it by saying it was time to effing take him down. He's a boring... Malcolm. He's talking about Malcolm. Got it. Right, okay. Glaub then tells Winkler that he went too far telling off Malcolm because Malcolm admires him and really likes him, although I don't know how anyone can feel that way towards Winkler because we've seen what he's like, right? Winkler responds that Malcolm is basically a Nazi, and then Glaub points out that some people aren't very interested in the Holocaust. I mean, Wink, until yesterday you weren't exactly, which is a great point that Winkler refuses to listen to by saying they're not entitled not to be interested, which is kind of insane to me because you can acknowledge that something is good or bad and not have to speak about it in detail yourself, you know? Like, if you're not educated in a topic, you shouldn't be made to speak about it in depth. Like, I've had people mad at me for not making a video about the whole Israel-Palestine thing, but I simply don't have enough of a detailed understanding of what's going on there and detailed knowledge of it to be able to speak about it with the level of nuance that it deserves. So I'm not going to. Yes, I'm against war in general. Yes, I'm against genocide, but I simply don't know enough about the whole history and the politics there to be able to speak about what is a very, very serious and emotional topic without... I don't even know where I was going with this. I don't have the knowledge to speak about what is a serious and complicated topic with any authority, you know? I would rather stay quiet and let people who are experts in this field, who have been studying global politics for God knows how many years, actually speak about it, instead of me being like, oh, well, I'm going to sit and read a few articles for a couple of weeks and then pretend I know everything. I feel like sometimes speaking up on a topic that you're not actually educated in is just muddying the waters and making sure that the people who are actually experts aren't being heard properly. I would rather stay quiet and let them talk about it than pretend I know what I'm talking about. I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm tired. I'm so tired. Basically, I'd rather be the one listening and learning than speaking about something that I don't know enough about. That's what I'm trying to say. And I feel like this is something that could have been interesting to discuss here. I think we can all acknowledge that the Holocaust was an absolutely awful, terrible, dreadful thing that none of us want to happen again. But that doesn't mean that everyone needs to go around talking about it all the time if they don't actually have the knowledge of what happened to talk about it. Does that make sense? If Giles had included a character who's like, oh yeah, like I absolutely agree it's bad, but I don't really feel comfortable talking about this because I don't know enough, that could have been and then Winkler had been like, oh, but you need to know enough, you need to blah, blah, blah. That would have been interesting, it would have raised a lot of questions and it could have been a good discussion. But instead of just making everyone who doesn't know enough about the Holocaust these like cartoon villains who mock what happened, it just kind of undermines everything, doesn't it? I don't know, it's poor writing. I'm tired. I'm rambling a little bit. I'm not sure where I'm going with this. And then the chapter ends. Winkler answers the phone to his granddad, and that is where the next chapter picks up. The next chapter is chapter 12, what Winkler's grandfather thought about it. So at this point, what you need to remember is that yesterday Winkler said he was going to visit his granddad, and then he didn't because he went and got drunk at home and then went to go see Wallenstein, or got forced into seeing Wallenstein and blah, 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 blah. So his granddad's like, where were you? And Winkler's a bad person. We know this. The grandfather got a friend to cook them like this proper meal and made like a big thing of everything, and Winkler just didn't show up because he's a selfish idiot and we hate him. So Winkler makes a bunch of excuses to his granddad and lies through his teeth for like 3 pages until he's just like, and then I met this old man downstairs, and then he tells his Jewish granddad about the Holocaust. I know. The granddad then points out how unusual this interest is, and it really is, you know. Suddenly you care so terribly about Hitler and the war and the Jews. It's not sudden, it's you've never mentioned it before. You've never mentioned anything about it. So I'm glad this was pointed out, but it's kind of skimmed over again, annoyingly. It's nice to see Winkler's hypocrisy be called out like this, but without him actually doing any introspection or work to figure out, you know, why are people calling him out? What does this mean? How can he grow and improve from this? It just kind of feels pointless, you know? The grandfather makes the exact same comments, almost word for word, as everyone else has about, and I quote, the shoes and the babies. Everyone's always met Mengele, blah, blah, blah. Again, I think the point is to show how everyone is always taught the same bits of history in school about this big bad event, and you know, so everyone kind of has the same talking points and they know the same shocking things, but no one really necessarily absorbs what it means or critically interacts with these things and thinks about this stuff for themselves. I think that's what it's maybe meant to be showing, but because it's so poorly written, it just comes across as repetitive because the writer didn't know what else to say or bring in. Like literally everyone, no matter their background and who they are or what they've been through, has had the same reaction so far. So I kind of wonder, like, what's the point in having all these different chapters and scenarios if they're all just saying the same thing over and over? It's annoying and a bit of a waste of time. Anyway, the grandfather accuses Wallenstein of making everything up because reasons, I guess. And then, just like everyone else, he also starts to mock Holocaust survivors. I find it hard to believe that an old Jewish man would mock Holocaust survivors, but here we are. Apparently everyone in this book mocks the Holocaust. I don't understand it. It's unbelievable. I don't know. Winkler calls his grandfather the C word a few times, like 7 times, and then puts the phone down on him, and the chapter ends, and I feel like I'm wasting my life with this book. Chapter 13 is titled Winkler's Brief Moment of Heroism, although that is not what I would use to describe the actions in this chapter. This is honestly one of the worst chapters yet. It's the worst. So, chapter 13, Winkler's Brief Moment of Heroism, which is not heroic at all. Stop it, I hate this. Right, it didn't start heroically or end heroically. I'm telling you that now. It didn't start heroically, far from it. It started with Winkler, disgusted by the greasy faces of his fellow passengers as he surged home from work with his gay briefcase full of misery, taking solace in the advertisements over the ventilator shafts in his carriage, specifically the girls. He watched the white swimsuited, almost nipple-showing blonde girls with caramel skin and graffitied eyes, and he began to plan a relaxing afternoon wank in his warm, empty flat. I hate everything about this book. Once more, can we please start a petition for Giles Coren to never be around women ever again?
Women often say that the most sexy thing about a man is the sense of humour. What I find sexy is a sense of humour, and it's just a terrible, terrible lie. If it were true, Woody Allen would not have had to marry his own daughter. If it were true, I would have had sex with a lot more women than I have. Whatever a man says, we all know that what a man finds sexy about a woman is tits and arse. Really what a woman finds sexy about a man is his money, isn't it? If a guy has money and power and makes a joke, a woman will laugh in the hope of sleeping with him and becoming his concubine or wife in order to get his money from him so when he dies, or when he divorces, when they get divorced. Whereas if just some jobless schmo says a funny thing, that's not going to help. There's no, a tramp says a funny line to you in the street, you're not going to stop and give him a blowjob, are you? And I was also very unlucky that I went to a very sort of famous English private school at Oxford University, so all the girls I knew were feminists, and they were brilliant and clever, but they were feminists, so they wouldn't do it in the doggy position because that was demeaning, and they wouldn't swallow because that was demeaning. So the only way they'd really have sex was on top, and if you wanted to do it to them in any other way other than that, they would think that this was a disempowerment and this was a kind of enslavement and this was a historical oppression, and it was all that Andrea Dworkin, all sex acts to some extent acts of rape. And so this was a thing that prevailed in the English education system for about 5 years. Then the women gave up and they just wanted to be like people always have wanted to be, but it's left me with a really bad sexual technique.
I just feel like after reading this book as a woman, I would not feel safe being in the same room as him. Rising on the escalator, accompanied by recurring and changing images in small poster boxes of half-dressed women who wanted him to buy things, Winkler felt that luxurious uncoiling that can persuade an unhappy man briefly that all is well. There were girls in summer dresses, crouching on the covers of bad novels, sticky red lips clamped around chocolates, women with dancers' legs straddling chairs in sheer tights and begging Winkler to come to the show. Is it too much to ask for just one woman in this book to not be sexualized? Just one, please. Just one, once. Winkler wondered whether he dare buy a porn mag at the corner shop at the end of his road. It would rather depend on which family member was manning the till, and plunged his not-holding briefcase hand into his trouser pocket, just for a tickle. Please stop it. Please stop just now. Again, this makes me feel like Giles Coren thinks it's normal for men to just touch their penises in public. This makes me think that Giles Coren regularly touches his penis in public, and it makes me very, very uncomfortable. It just keeps going as well. It just keeps going. A black woman whose nipples had hardened in her pink bikini explained that you could call such countries as Nigeria and Ghana for as little as 1p, though Winkler had not even a penny's worth of things to say to anyone in Ghana. A youngish mother with her little girl and husband strolled on a hot sunny day through Disney World, marvelling at the gothic majesty of the Magic Castle. Her pale green pleated skirt clung to her thigh and showed the shape down to where her golden suntanned leg emerged. Literally, no woman is safe. He sexualizes all of them, even a mother in an advertisement with her kid. Stop it. He continues to touch himself on the escalator and thinks about finishing there and then, in public, in his trousers. Stop it. He sexualizes yet another woman on a poster until a man bumps into him, and then, only then, does he decide to stop. I hate this. There are pages of this. Why? Winkler then sees a blind girl who happens to be a goth and offers a bunch of offensive descriptors for her, the nicest of which is him asking himself, do blind people dye their hair? Probably not. Surely they are above or below or just a long, long way from such vain gestures. He goes on to call her a weirdo and so much worse, and then starts thinking about having sex with her, and I just cannot deal with this disgusting crap anymore. Seriously, it's every woman. Winkler stared, the better to form judgments, and then thought he shouldn't stare at people. It was rude. And then thought, it, she's blind and can't see me staring. And then he thought maybe she could sense him staring. They're good at that. Who is this for? Then we get maybe like our 15th blam of the book or something like that, as out of nowhere a random man just punches the blind girl in the face. Yeah, that happens. The girl went down with a silent whump. A UN rice bag famine relief sack slump. A bullet in the back of the head from close range while blindfolded and expecting life to continue, knee buckle and slow-mo sink. What the hell are these metaphors, really? Stop it. And he starts to chase this man, and there's a lot of swear words. Winkler contemplated murder. I saw him, I'll catch him, I'll effing kill him. What sort of man punches a blind girl like that without robbing her or anything? Maybe it was just a domestic, though. You don't get involved in other people's domestic arguments no matter what. Until he hits her, of course, which he just had. And who would do that? Nobody. Maybe he hadn't. Wow, so deep, so thoughtful, so insightful. Shut up. He doesn't catch the man, so he heads back to the subway where the girl is still there. At the entrance to the subway tunnel, kneeling, slumped, her head in her hands and shaking, Winkler noticed when he got closer. Nobody had come to help her, but then not many would have seen it happen. It would have been easy to assume this was just another drunk goth having an episode in the subway, collapsed perhaps, and after squatting for a piss. Winkler tells her to get up because she's sitting in a puddle, and tells her the man looked Scottish because he looked hungry, weak, drunk, ignorant, willful, violent, sad, resentful, and dirty. Giles really just wants to insult everyone he can, doesn't he? Winkler thinks that he should take her to a police station, but he doesn't know where one is, so instead he's like, come back to my flat. And she's like, mate. And then he goes, I can't believe I have to read this out loud. Look, I promise I'm not a baddie. Although I probably shouldn't suggest going back to my flat with me because really, in principle, you shouldn't come. And it's wrong of me to suggest it and put you in the position of having to decide whether I'm an axe-wielding rapist psychopath or not. So don't if you don't want to, but I do just want to help. And I feel bad because I didn't manage to catch the effer who hit you. I feel so guilty, I feel responsible for all the people who can see and just... Are you serious? Are you serious? Like, you can tell this was written by a man because no woman, blind or not, would ever go to a stranger's house just because he promised her, I promise I'm not a baddie.
Are we the baddies?
Anyway, for some reason she agrees, and it turns out her name is Jenny Marie and she is American. And at Winkler's flat, she immediately notices the bad smell, and Winkler has a daydream about her, thinking that he's a murderer and running away and getting hit by a car, and then Giles throws in another blam because it's his go-to noise for everything. I'm so tired of this. I wonder if he asks his wife if they're gonna blam tonight. I don't want to know. I wonder what his wife thinks of this book. I wonder if she's considered divorcing him after having read it. I would. If Kieran wrote this, I'd be like, mate, are you okay? Do we need to have a talk? Shall I book you an appointment to see a therapist? Anyway, the girl, Jenny Marie, says that the smell is rabbit, frozen rabbit, and then makes what I think is a racist comment about how no one eats that shit back home but the black people. The dirt poor jobless have to travel on the bus as black people. In America, white people don't have to eat rodent. I feel dirty having just read this stuff. So Winkler calls the police, and well, he calls 999, and he gets the operator, and the operator's a woman, and so he immediately sexualizes her because, God's sake, he wanted to know where the telephonist worked. Was it nearby? He liked her voice. Why was a Canadian on the other end of his phone doing this job? Was she specially trained? Was she better looking than this other non-native of the North American continent that he had here in his living room? He imagined her looking like the only other Canadian he'd ever met. Donna. Women literally can't even just do their job without being creeped on, can they? Winkler then kind of, you know, zones out and ignores most of what Jenny Marie is saying until she mentions a boyfriend, and then he starts to ask if the boyfriend back home in America, I think it is blind. That's what Winkler wanted to know. He wanted to know about sex. Surely a sighted man wouldn't have a blind girlfriend. Mind you, then he could fuck whoever he wanted right in front of her even, and she'd never know. Did her boyfriend ever, assuming that he could see, creep up and stick his in her mouth when she's sitting reading and doesn't know he's there? Reading Braille, of course. Head up, mouth lolling idly. Wham! Winkler would if it were him, and if he were blind, then how would he get aroused without the visual element? Not that the visual element is much in her case. Best if he is blind, probably. But then how does he know if he's about to come in her face or on her... Oh, God's sake. Or on her or in her ear or something? Does it sting if he spaffs her right in the eye, or does being blind mean it's no big deal? Like, what the hell is wrong with this man? Who writes this? Who thinks this and writes, is this meant to be funny? Because it's not. What's the point in any of this? Winkler gets an erection from thinking about all this crap and then assaults her. Like, actually. Winkler could even whip it out right here and she would never know. As long as he wasn't turned on just because she was there and could not see, as long as he was just going to finish his now the way he was planning to anyway, and just not bothering to go to the bog to do it, as he would if she were any other girl, because there was no point since she was naturally protected from the profanity of it as it was. He said, easing his out of his trousers as Jenny Marie explained how she had at first thought it was a robbery, at least after the first few seconds when there had been no room for thought at all. And then he masturbates in front of her without her consent, like literally in front of her face. And he thinks that this is okay to do because she's blind. And then at the last minute, he moves out of the way and he ejaculates on the TV, but like right next to her. This is not okay. I don't care if a person is blind or not. You don't do this to someone without their consent. It's assault. But apparently, it's okay that he does this because he does consider raping her but then decides not to, so that makes him a good guy. Remember the title of this chapter, Winkler's moment of heroism. He moved closer to her, tried not to breathe, wondered if he could come on her face and say he tripped with a glass of warm milk. No, F, but he could F her. She could never identify him. He could F her and then take her out and leave her on the street, and that would be that. I can't believe I'm even reading this. I feel violated even reading about it. It's disgusting. But apparently it's okay because he realises that he shouldn't rape someone, because what would that mean about him? That would be rape. Christ, and worse. Imagine what it would mean to her, that after such a terrible random act in the subway, the next man who happened by, and there were 3 billion men on Earth it might have been, was one who, having stopped to help her, was prepared to rape her. What would that mean about humanity? But none of that stops him violating her in the other way of masturbating in front of her. He seems to think this act is just like so normal and so like, yeah, this is fair, she's blind, men probably do it to her all the time. He literally stops and thinks, I wonder how often this happens. I wonder how many men do this. No, this is not normal. This is not how men behave. Stop it. So he masturbates, he ejaculates, and he's like right in front of her face, and then he ejaculates and he moves and he gets it on the TV next to her. But apparently enough that sperm has covered her body. Little tiny sperm cells, millions of sperm cells, all covering her body everywhere. Remember that, it's important. The police arrive and take her home, and the chapter ends with the line, and the next morning, without any fuss, Winkler pushed a fat woman under a train. I wouldn't go as far as to call Winkler an actual rapist, but he is definitely a sexual predator and has assaulted and considered assaulting women multiple times throughout this book. He's a dangerous man. There is nothing that could possibly redeem him in any way at this point with how he's behaved. And the fact that Giles Coren seems to think that this is normal and okay and acceptable makes me worried about what kind of man he is. So that's the end of part 2. Now we're on to part 3 and chapter 14, which is titled Winkler Starts a New Life. I wrote in my notes, if this doesn't start with him getting his penis chopped off, I don't care. And sadly, it doesn't. So I don't care. This chapter opens with, Winkler danced and Winkler sang. Winkler lived life to the full. He lived now not in the big bad house of smells and wetness up north, but in the newly fashionable west of the city, with Albuquerque. Mary is long gone now, the house too. The office and Millfield Spawn, Sherwood Grubb, Pritchard and Leo Sneal. Winkler's been sleeping with a beautiful dancer, long-legged, wet-lipped, horse-eyed and smokily spoken, who lives like he does, in the 6-bed end of terrace early Victorian house of Rupert Theophrax Hensley de Wilde, bright and white and full of light and blah 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 blah. I don't care. I really don't care. And if you're thinking, oh, this is like a big time jump, yeah it is. For stupid reasons. After Winkler pushed the lardy lass under the steaming choo-choo down under the ground right at the end of the old life, he knew he could not go back to the flat. Yeah, I actually just had to read that sentence. Because then it would have been meaningless. An entirely gratuitous act. Any more than he could go back to the job, and not being big on friends, he could think of no one to call but Rue. So Rupert, this rich guy, he's the friend of Will's who he mocked earlier in the book for like however many pages. At this point I was wondering if this whole section of the book was like some sort of delusion from a prison cell that he was having and like none of this actually happened, but no. Sadly, it actually happens. So Winkler calls up Rue, and Rue's dialogue is written once again in the most obnoxious way with this attempt at, like, writing down some sort of dialect, but I don't even know what it's supposed to be. Look at this. Anyway, that was 6 days ago. Since then, Winkler has moved into a whitewashed room on the 3rd floor with dark, unpolished floorboards, a cast-iron bed, and a large classroom cupboard full of books. Old books. Asterix, Tintin, Jennings, William, Famous Five, Arthur Ransom, Abbott's O-Level Physics, yards of R.J. Unstead, most of which he has stacked on the floor either side of the large black iron fireplace to make room for the clothes he has brought round and about as he pottered the streets wondering what to do next, sitting at small iron tables drinking coffee, reading second-hand books he bought in shops, which charged more than the books cost new for the cachet of that well-thumbed look, and staring at all the girls, all blonde, hard-bodied, large-breasted, tight-dressed, on the phone, inside shades, big-teethed, leather-booted, and looking easy to he thought, as a hole in a bath sponge. Please learn how and when to use a full stop. I beg you, please. So after living with Rue for 3 days, after pushing a woman under a train, and yes, that hasn't really been addressed yet, but it will be very vaguely at some point, but not in any detail. So after living there for 3 days, he meets a woman called Albuquerque. Seriously, yes. And then, of course, we get the obligatory several paragraphs of him just objectifying her and describing her body in sexual ways. She's only wearing a towel, and he thinks to himself, wow, never seen one of those before without its clothes on. Can we please not refer to women as it? please. This is swiftly followed by, Jesus, what am I? A couple of days ago I killed a woman for just being fat. I'm surely not afraid to just ask some hippie tart out for lunch just because she's got big hooters and a hard arse. I can't cope with this anymore. I can't cope with any of this book. I hate it. I hate it all. Winkler does a bunch of cocaine with a bunch of rich people in this new house he's living in. Then there's pages of nonsense about cocaine and football. Rich people doing rich people stuff. More drugs, drinking, parties, more and more drugs, blah blah blah. Boring stuff, really. A big deal is made of Winkler dancing at a party after his whole "oh my god, he refused to dance" 2-page arc earlier. It really is pointless. I don't know if this is an attempt at character development, but it's just pathetic. I can't cope with this. I hate everything about this book. It's stressing me out so much. This isn't like funny, haha, we'll have a giggle bad. This is just bad in every way. It's depressing me bad. So he takes this Albuquerque woman home, but he can't sleep with her because of all the drugs, so his penis is soft. And then she keeps trying in the most unsexy way to get him hard again. Apparently she took it in her mouth, tugging at the sorry bulb with her teeth, flicking the opening with her tongue. Can we no, stop it. Teeth. No. What follows is a sex scene so bad it would put Colleen Hoover to shame. Now, I'm gonna skip out a lot of this because I've been demonetized to hell over Colleen Hoover's sex scenes before, so I think it's gonna happen again here. So I'm skipping out the worst of it, but I'm just gonna give you some, not even highlights, lowlights, low points, a couple of bits. I might censor it a bit. We'll see. Okay. So Winkler's in and out of consciousness with all the drugs and alcohol he's done, and the woman ties him up without his consent. And well, he's kind of like, it's hard. He's not saying no, and he kind of acts like he likes it, but at the same time he's so out of it that no, he's not consenting. And he will anyway. It's not good. This is why I'm dubious about calling this a sex scene. Basically, this woman ties him up and sticks a finger up his bum without asking. Again, not okay, always get consent. She starts biting his chest and shoulders. Again, also not okay without consent. And then, can't believe I have to read this. She pulled his dick up to the perpendicular and buried it in her mouth, at the same time slipping something else into his ass, hard and bigger than fingers. Winkler suddenly thought, Christ, she's an effing man, but she was sucking him so it couldn't be her something she must have prepared earlier because he didn't have anything this shape in his bedroom. And then the tingling became also painful and Winkler was about to cry out, but she thrust a pillow in his face and held it down. So you've got what seems like a little bit of transphobia in there as well. None of this feels consensual. I'm not okay with this. So she puts this pillow on his face and then sits on it and he can't breathe properly. And at this point I was like, oh, well maybe some good's gonna come of this. Maybe he's gonna die. But sadly he does not. Not that anyone deserves rape and stuff, but I wouldn't mind if this character died. I really wouldn't. I'd be okay with that. And then you ready for this? This is all one poorly written sentence. And he came hard in her mouth, and his jumped around and rattled on her teeth, and he blacked out, and she took his out of her mouth and lifted herself from his face and whipped the pillow away, and he gasped and glugged at the air, and he came again so hard that his wrenched out of her hand, and a shot of it hit him straight in the eye and stung like nothing he'd ever had in there, and he yelled with the pain, but the yell couldn't have been anything. And as she grabbed at his, which was leaping around like a shower dropped in an empty bath, she scratched his back deeply with the nails on both hands, and he shot 3 more times in thick stripes on her chest, full stop, like Zorro. And this is somehow presented as a good thing. It will not surprise any of you to learn that this scene won awards for how bad it is. I genuinely thought this whole scene might be some sort of hallucination, but no, apparently it's real. This actually happened. End of chapter. Chapter 15. The beginnings of a police investigation. Winkler's hungover and coming down off a crap ton of drugs, and the police turn up at the door, and there's this page-long I'm not even joking, a page-long sentence about all the mess that's in the house. It's unnecessary, and it's boring. Winkler rushes around trying to clean up, but he's a mess, and he fantasizes about the police killing him with more blams, and then he finds some MDMA in the flat, so he just snorts a bunch of MDMA, and then he looks at a crossword, and then he remembers the police are at the door, so he goes back, and then he tries to let them in, and they're like, mate, that took you like half an hour, and he's like, this is what drugs do to you kids, stay away from them. The police know who he is, and they've come to see him, and he's like, oh my god, you must know about the murder where he pushed a woman under a train, and he's like, the murder, my murder, which kind of reminded me of that bit from, I don't know if you guys have seen Psychoville, but there's this bit with this guy, he's like a true crime fanatic, and then he gets hired to do these like murder mystery parties, but he messes it up really bad, and he goes home to his mum and he's like, I've done a bad murder, but then she thinks that he's actually murdered someone, and like it's this whole thing where like she's gonna try and help him cover up a murder that he hasn't actually committed. And anyway, Winkler's murder, my murder bit reminded me of the I've done a bad murder bit from that. Anyway.
Sorry, Mum. I did a bad murder.
Not the point. I'm on a tangent here. Then we get a flashback to when Winkler actually killed the woman. It's a waste of time. Down into the underground in the early morning and the platform's already rammed. Down to the business end, the rocketing hammer and anvil, cylinder and piston, death-dealing steel thump at its most merciless. And in among the jostling jostlers, knowing where the doors will fall and elbowing, shuffling, needing the doughy populace for position, the woman in the grey suit with the black blocky rubber-soled half-smart work and rape-escaping footwear, yes, that's a sentence he wrote, white t-shirt and cheap necklace, piggy face like Mary the Broadbean then in his life, flat-permed, wattle-necked, slack-kneed, gigantic, pointless, ugly, ill, carrying a too-big handbag, great sack of poop and supplies, and reading a folded magazine designed for a woman like her, full of help that won't and advice that can't, chewing a banana, diet number 23, and that only this year, eat anything yellow during the daylight and then as much fish as you like after midnight, not noticing the space opening in front of her, right in the space where the doors won't fall and the herd knows it. I hate everything about this, and yes, again, that was all one sentence. I know. Everything from the way Giles thinks about women in general to the way this is written is just poor. And it gets worse. Winkler, as the rumble rumbles moving through the herd, pressing through the weak points where shoulders touch shoulders, and the rumble rumbles louder and more metallic, tinnier and higher. Winkler at a tipping trot there at the last minute, as the heads down in newspaper pages look up and the pages are folding away for the press onto the train, one or two stepping involuntarily back from the line, Winkler at the last minute with his hand out, rushing for the gap before the train, and if she moves now at the last minute, over goes Winkler like he always feared, into the on-rushing slam of red and grey, but she's big enough to stop him, hand out into her back and side, and no movement from her at first as his hands sink in, and she all yielding and fleshy, rumbly like a waterbed. The rest of her wobbling around as Winkler sinks in deeper, but more conviction in his lean as her head starts to turn and stagger, and all eyes firmly on the approaching train, and then oof, there she goes, there she blows, the great whale. The magazine flies, the bag is clutched, oddly, pointlessly. Oh, it's all timed so nicely for an aerial collision, and it's touch and go, which will go. It may be curtains for the train, but no, blam! Screaming, obviously, not hers, too late for that. She is a multicoloured mist and smoke. Winkler's scream is the first out the hole. Well, he was nearest, and this is gonna for life, him and the driver, though the driver will get counselling. Oh, they're all screaming now, like they've never seen death before. Jesus, one life extinguished without pain or anguish. Remember, and they're all going nuts. It's not as if there's a shortage of people. 6 billion more people where that came from. And the point of all this, apparently, is that people shouldn't be shocked because she was just, in his words, one fat slag, and 6 million more people died in the Holocaust. So why are people bored by that but shocked by this? I do not have the words to express how stupid this is. But then back to the present day, and it turns out the police aren't there at all about the woman he murdered on the train platform, but they're there about another woman who has been murdered, Jenny Marie, the blind girl that he came close to raping. I come here to talk to you about Jenny Marie Rollins, a poor bloody helpless foreigner in this country, a poor blind girl who was murdered at her home last night by an intruder. raped and murdered Mr. Winkler, so please do pay attention to me. I've been made aware that you were known to the dead girl, and I want to know if she said anything in your meetings that might help us identify the attacker. Oh, thank God, Winkler wheezed. Why can't this piece of crap just face any comeuppance? The next few pages are just the police being completely incompetent, one calling Winkler a hero for chasing the guy who punched the girl, and then wanting to find out more information about him, and then they leave. The police officers say that they're going to nail him for something much bigger, the murder of Miss Rawlinson, but they meant Rollins. It's this joke that the police are incompetent and keep getting her name wrong. It's stupid. I don't know if we're meant to be shocked or appalled or rooting for him to be framed for the murder or rooting for him to get away with this other. I don't know what Giles wants us to do. All I know is I hate this book and I hate my life right now. The police chat outside the house. You saw the way he was, pretending to be relaxed, pretending to be surprised. He's a desperate young fellow, confused, alienated, riddled with drugs, friendless, unhinged, rootless, spoiled. Chase the assailant away my arse. There was no assailant, Tolkien. It's all in his imagination. He whacked her himself that afternoon, then bottled out of the rape, the nihilistic act that would catalyse for him in his mind the desperate philosophical circumstances in which he found himself, and then he went back to copulate with her dead body last night, hoping it would look like a sex game gone wrong. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised, but sadly, no, that's not what happened. Turns out that this woman was murdered in exactly the same way as Winkler was, like, having sex or assaulted last night. I don't know. The whole, like, Zorro thing with the bite marks and the sticking something up his bum and the scratches and stuff and the, like, Zorro, like, I don't know. Apparently all that happened to Winkler also happened to Jenny as well. So I was like, oh, I bet he actually did it, and this was all just like a big drug-fueled hallucination, and most of what's been happening here isn't real. And I was like, I don't care if that is what's happened, I just want to see him in prison, that would be great, and then the book ends there. But sadly, none of that is what happened. I hate life. Chapter 16 is titled The Truth About Albuquerque. I know. Winkler was off the hook on one crime. Hardly a crime. The spiritually exuberant culling of a single, faceless, well, practically faceless, and certainly faceless now, fat and useless prole. Useless, ugly, fat, less than Winker, and yes, unprovable, unpunishable incident for which he was not ashamed of being responsible. He could hold his head up high about that one. He really would. He simply would not accept that a single individual death in a world overpopulated with invalid souls was something for which one needed to weep. Killing had set him free. This gets worse too. Are you ready? But this crime of which Porphyry, the police officer, clearly suspected him, was something different. Why? The blind girl was young. The blind girl was not fat. The blind girl was blind. Winkler's eugenic code allowed for the disregard of human lives that were unproductive, ugly, brutish, and too voracious of the resources, air, food, space, beauty, of which humans have only a finite supply. Fat people consume far more for no greater return. They are a messy horde grazing dumbly and moving on as the feeding grounds shrink and shrink. But like elephants on a wildlife reserve, they could not be allowed to multiply indefinitely and kill all the trees. Yeah, this is as bad as it sounds. But Winkler was not out to exterminate the vulnerable. It was not about killing disabled people. It was not about racial or genetic purity. He had very deliberately pushed a white woman under the train lest his act be misrepresented by himself above all as a race killing. People cannot help certain things and thus cannot have their cultural value judged by them. Fat people can help it. Fat people can be judged. The killing of a blind girl was an ugly act, a vile, cruel, cowardly act, an act from which its perpetrator derived pleasure. A rape. Nice, smooth, white, cool skin, soft brown hair. Winkler had derived no pleasure from the murder he had committed. It had been a matter of urgent necessity, not of pleasure-seeking. Poor Jenny Marie was a person. I know as the audience we're meant to see the irony and hypocrisy in this, but I can't help but feel like this is actually how Giles Coren sees the world. It wouldn't surprise me. He tries to call his girlfriend Mary. She's obviously upset and worried about him because he's just disappeared for like a week. And he's all like, don't be hysterical. And then he puts the phone down on her, and then he calls back up, and then he dumps her. And then Rue and some other guy comes home, and it's a mess, and they all talk about bitches and sex and nonsense, and that's where the chapter ends. What are we doing with our lives? Why are we still here? Chapter 17 is called Containing 25 Little Chapters in Which an Awful Lot Happens. A debatable title. Winkler's been asked to go in for another police interview, but he tries to reschedule by saying his granddad has died so he can go and play cricket with Rue and his rich family instead. Rue's family is, like I say, stupidly rich, and it's just a bunch of bland rich people doing rich people things for a few pages. I don't care. Turns out one of Rue's family friends playing cricket with them is some rich kid that Winkler knew back when he was in school. Remember that rich kid from the first chapter where I was like, remember him, he pops back up. This is where he pops back up, to absolutely no consequence. That's it. There's pages and pages of repeating what happened in the first chapter. It feels unnecessary. It is absolutely page filler. This book could have been half as long and still be too boring. There's an unnecessary scene in the police station and an unnecessary scene with Mary crying. Then a random scene where Ginger Bill, also from chapter 1, he pops back up. He comes in and hits some guy for saying that his beard is grey, and then it just cuts to another scene, so I don't really get the context of that, but it happened. Will gets a phone call, I think from the police or something like that, asking about Winkler and where he is, and then the book asks us, the narrator asks us, because remember there were a couple of those like breaking the fourth wall moments in the beginning of the book, and then it was forgotten about for the whole book. Comes back up again here and asks, Winkler is still our hero, isn't he? I get trying to be self-aware, but I don't think he was ever the hero of this book. And after he considered rape, I don't think he ever will be again, so shut up. Then we get more scenes of the current day cricket match, and then it cuts back to the office where Winkler works, and unsurprisingly he's getting fired, thankfully. I am shocked it took this long. Finally though, someone has seen sense, because they say he just swanned in and out when he chose, never took any responsibility for anything. He was drunk half the time, he never dressed properly, he spent the time he was here harassing secretaries and being snooty about everyone, and bitter. And he was being paid how much? Effing hell. What does he think we are? I can't believe it. And that Worthy report, he was going to trick you into thinking he'd done it by the end of the week, but I'll bet he didn't do it at all, Cher. So I was like, it's about time, thank God, finally some consequences. Sadly, in this book, we never actually see Winkler finding out that he was fired, and he never faces any real consequences, so it falls flat. It's very frustrating. The story cuts back to the cricket match, and again, it's all kind of incoherent rambling, but at some point, it's kind of hard to follow. But the police turn up to arrest Winkler for the murder of this Jenny Marie person. Winkler starts to beat up the dad of his friend Rue for some reason. Apparently this guy was being like anti-Semitic, I think, so Winkler starts beating him up. Everyone there thinks Winkler is a drug dealer for some reason, and then the police arrest Winkler for rape and murder, and then the chapter ends. That was a lot of pages for honestly not really a lot happening. I don't know. I mean, like, kind of a lot happened, but also not a lot happened. I don't care. That's what it is. I do not care. Chapter 18 is titled De Profundis Bill. South of the city, on the bank of a wide, desolate, polluted, filthy, lifeless river, stands a town. One of the true F-holes of the whole country. In the town there is a fortress. In the fortress a prison. In the prison, already confined for 3 days, is unbailed convict number 20710, known to us and everyone else as Winkler. Cool. Can you just stay there and then this is how the book ends, please? Done. Thanks. No, sadly, somehow there's still 4 more chapters to go. 4. Ugh. Winkler refuses to give them a DNA sample, even though they've been like, hey, if you just give it us, it can exonerate you if you're not guilty. But Winkler's like, no, I don't want to give you one, but I do have an alibi. I was with Albuquerque when the murder and rape happened, but the police can't get hold of her to confirm his alibi, so even Winkler himself starts to wonder, maybe he did kill the girl. It's not impossible. Christ, can it really not be impossible? Technically, it isn't impossible, I suppose. Winkler paced up and down his cell. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, turn. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, turn. Suppose I was so by all those stupid drugs that I don't remember properly what happened that night. Yeah, you think? Don't do drugs, kids. So I left the party with Alba after we did that line of coke in the bog. She never stroked my balls, obviously. I imagine that. I left the party with her because I was obviously too effed to stand up, and damn, I didn't dance after all. Eff it. I knew it was a dream. Crap, what a shame. And then he basically goes through this whole several pages of like, well, obviously I don't remember doing the murder, but if I did do the murder, then here's how I did it. Sound familiar? He starts to be all like, what if all the stuff I thought was being done to me was actually me doing it to her, and blah, blah, blah. You know, all that stuff we realised 2 chapters ago and kind of wished was actually happening because it would be a more interesting story. But no, none of that actually happened. Someone else murdered her. Winkler sadly is innocent and someone else did the murdering, and this is all a waste of time. So in the prison, in jail, Uncle Bill turns up. Ginger Bill, the one we haven't heard about since the first chapter and that random 1 page in the last chapter, and he turns up at the jail because I think apparently he's back in jail at this point and he's in the same jail, but he's friends with the wardens and he's in prison for armed robbery, accessory to murder, guilty as charged, convicted and punished. Not much I can say, very stupid, my fault. Then we get some more racism, and then Bill is all like, of course you didn't do it. And he says, and again, are we ready for just like offending everyone in 1 paragraph? So Uncle Bill, Ginger Bill, says, the killer will be a mad, paranoid, schizophrenic, out on care in the community. It always is. Some Armenian, probably. Some asylum-seeking fascist Croat here to wash windscreens with an oily rag and rape and murder our women. He'll confess in the end, they always do. But until he does, it's almost impossible for the old Bill to do anything. They like to make an arrest. They whack up a few yellow signs in the road and wait for a confession. But they can't go after the G-slurs every time there's a rape and murder. The Home Office PR team would do their nut. So they wait for the G-slurs to confess, they always do. Weird Slavic guilt thing. No one here has learned anything throughout this whole book, have they? What is character development? They all start off awful, they all end awful. It gets... Well, this is said, okay. So there are similarities between your screwing of the Australian girl and the rape of the blind girl. So what? Dirty, violent sex is only rape with consent. And anyway, it was you who was on the receiving end. I think. And you didn't give your consent to your Albuquerque girl, did you? No, what are you trying to say? I don't know. She didn't rape me, Bill. A pole up your arse though, son. Isn't that a bit extreme? Well, you know. Look, they've got a lot of good reasons to hold you, but none of them is watertight. Why don't you do the DNA test? I don't know. I held her all the way home, stuff like that. She could have had a few hairs on her or something. Then they'd charge me and I'd be effed. And Billy's like, you'll be fine, hairs don't count, they know you were with her. What they're looking for is to match the sperm, right? Because whoever raped her got sperm in her and on her and all that sort of thing. And Winkler's like, but oh my god, because I masturbated in front of her in my house and finished near her, that means my sperm is going to be all over her. To which I have no sympathy because, yeah, you violated her and basically assaulted her and you deserve to be punished for that. Then, for some reason, Uncle Bill decides it's time that we learn the real backstory of what happened with Winkler's dad and why he doesn't have a dad. And basically, his dad was a Jewish man who fell in love with a woman who wasn't Jewish and wanted to marry her. And her dad threatened him with a shotgun. So years pass, and he gets married to a Jewish woman who is described as an ugly girl, great body, very rich. I hate this book. Long story short, the Jewish wife becomes super traditional and the dad's like, ew, I don't want anything to do with that, and then goes off to sleep with another woman who's not Jewish. They have a kid together. That kid is Winkler. The other woman kills herself, and then the kid that is Winkler goes to live with the grandfather while all the others move to Israel. And that's why Winkler doesn't know his dad, because his mum is dead and his dad just had him in an affair and abandoned him. Right, okay, bit of an anticlimax. Like, we knew most of this stuff already. And Billy's like, you're a Jew, Winkler. Your dad was a Jew. Your grandfather was a Jew. You're a Jew. Next chapter. Chapter 19 is titled The Truth About Arnold Finkel. So again, this is where things get even more confusing. It turns out that one of the police officers that arrested Winkler, who goes by Sergeant Tolkien, is actually a Jewish man whose real name is Arnold Finkel, and he knows Bill, Uncle Bill, Ginger Bill. Right. The sergeant, Arnold, tells Winkler that they illegally collected his DNA from Mary's hairbrush and got a match for him at Jenny Marie's flat, by which they mean they found his semen on her and someone else's, apparently. Arnold warns Winkler that another police officer will be down here later to find out who your accomplice was, and he'll probably get violent now. Arnold apparently is like, but I want to help you, mate, because you're Jewish and I'm Jewish and us Jewish people need to stick together. and sometimes people make jokes about him being Jewish, and he's sure that Winkler gets jokes about him being Jewish, so they both try and hide their Jewishness, but now they can secretly be Jewish together, so they're helping each other out. I'm not joking, this is genuinely what happens in the book. Arnold asks Winkler if he slept with Jenny Marie, because he thinks that after Winkler saved her from the attacker, she would have probably been like, and this is a quote, "Oh, thank you, kind sir, smoochy, smoochy, sucky, sucky, wham, bam, we have something to go on." Yes, those are real words written by an adult. Arnold then asks, did you offer her a glass of milk and then beat into it because she'd need a protein boost after the shock, but then she swallowed it, realised what she'd done thanks to her heightened senses of taste and smell, and puked it all over herself? Again, these are words written by an actual adult trying to be funny. And it's not funny. So Winkler confesses that he masturbated next to her face and body, but he finished on the TV screen honest, like that makes it okay, but this is probably how some of his sperm got onto her. Surely that's a crime as well though, right? But apparently that's overlooked and it gives him an excuse. And also, let's think about the timeline here, right? This has all happened over several days. Like, so he saves this girl, masturbates on her essentially. Next morning he kills a woman, goes missing, goes on this like 3-day bender, meets a woman, thinks about asking her out, another 3 days pass, he gets really high and does a bunch of drugs with her. Then this Jenny Marie is killed, and then the police turn up the next morning. So apparently in 6 days, this woman hasn't washed herself or showered or anything, and is still covered head to toe in his sperm. So much sperm that they can't tell where it came from, or when, or if it was the result of rape, or if it had been their date. Like, Giles doesn't understand forensics, clearly. But apparently, it's so stupid, right? It's so stupid. Anyway, there's like apparently a page and a half about the physics of sperm flying through the air and how it might have hit the woman, and now they need to prove that it came from him masturbating in front of her unconsensually, which in this universe somehow isn't a crime. Apparently they need to prove that it came from that, because if that's how it happened, then his sperm will also be on the shoes of the police officers who picked her up from his flat and in the police car. None of this is how, like, forensics work. I'm actually angry at how stupid all of this is. And then the book talks directly to the audience again out of nowhere, asking, well, if Winkler did not kill the blind girl, and I'm sure we're all very relieved about that, then perhaps he didn't kill the fat woman either. What do you mean we saw him? We did not. We knew it was always likely. We knew everything seemed to be tending that way. We know he thinks he did, and we know the whole episode rushed through his mind when he was full of recreational drugs and sitting opposite two ludicrously sketched policemen, but we can't be sure. It's so stupid. He did push the woman under. It's confirmed later, so I don't get the point in this. And it also turns out that apparently Winkler's sperm really is everywhere in the police car and on policemen's shoes, and ooh, sperm. It's absolutely everywhere in the world. So he's free to go. Stupid. Oh, and apparently the woman Albuquerque really does exist, and police managed to track her down, and she did provide him with an alibi. So, ooh, look, he's doubly off the hook. Boo. Chapter 20 is titled The Truth About Winkler. Winkler finally gets to visit his granddad, and a whole lot of nothing happens for pages. Winkler rides a stair lift up to the flat, says the flat smells, no one cares. This is pages of my life just wasted. He tells his grandfather that he was in prison, and the grandfather is obviously disappointed in him. I think that's perfectly understandable, right? There are these big page-long paragraphs of the granddad ranting about just everything and anything, and I have no patience left to read out this nonsense, so let's quickly move on. Winkler gets mad that his granddad taught him things like table manners instead of not to masturbate in front of blind girls or beat people up. Like those aren't just common decency. He's like, why didn't you specifically tell me not to masturbate in front of blind girls? Why? This is all your fault. It's so stupid. It is actually so stupid. Basically, he blames his granddad for everything that makes him an absolute crap person. Like, I'm sorry, but you're like 30 years old at this point in the book. It's your own fault. Winkler screams and cries at his grandfather, acting like a petulant child, and then has an actual tantrum where he's like rolling around on the floor. I cannot stand to read this nonsense. It is pathetic. He's a 30-year-old man having a full-on tantrum, going, no one understands me, and rolling on the floor, being like, you're a terrible grandfather, I'm so special and no one understands me. Like, why? Why is this in here? The grandfather comforts him, which is more than he deserves, and he's like, there, son, there. Pathetic. We get the truth about Winkler, as the grandfather tells Winkler that, you know what, you're not actually my real grandson. Oof, shock. It's another long, dull tale of family histories. The granddad met a Hungarian woman and fell in love, but she was already married. This woman wasn't Jewish. She was also married to a man who wasn't Jewish, but the granddad is Jewish. So he falls in love with this woman. They start an affair. She leaves... No, the husband goes off to war, and she's like, oh, but I'm not going to leave my husband. But then the husband dies at the war, so she's like, okay, well, I guess I'll leave my husband. And she goes and lives with the grandfather, and they're, like, doing this thing, but it turns out she was already pregnant from the other guy, the first husband. And then she has the baby, and then she dies, and then the granddad is like, oh, now I have the baby of this woman who I loved, who I was having an affair with, but it's not my baby, it's her baby, so it's this non-Jewish baby, but that's okay, I'll raise it anyway. And that's Winkler's dad. So it turns out that baby's not Jewish, so the dad isn't Jewish. Winkler's mum, who the dad had the affair with, wasn't Jewish, so Winkler himself isn't Jewish. So all of this stuff that has been going on about, like, Winkler hiding his Jewish side and blah, 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 blah. Like, it doesn't really matter, because if we're looking at it purely biologically, he's not Jewish. And even though he's circumcised, he hasn't been raised Jewish, and he doesn't believe any Jewish beliefs, so he's not Jewish. So the whole thing was a waste of time. Then we finally get Winkler showing some real emotion for the first time in the book, and he's like, oh my god, even though I'm not your grandson, you raised me. You didn't have to. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. And you know what? That's actually a nice moment. It's nice. And then Granddad's like, I've always been your real dad. And he's like, yeah, sure, whatever, okay. Cool, great, right. It would be a nice moment if I cared at all about any of these characters, but I don't. Then there's this thing where Winkler's like, everything is going to be different now, Granddad. I'm going to do all these things with you and everything is going to be nice and meh, meh, meh. And then there's like this fake out where they make it seem like the Granddad's died, but then he hasn't died. And he's like, oh, no, okay, you're awake, cool. Bye. And then Winkler leaves and the chapter ends. I know. Chapter 21, The Truth About Wallenstein. Finally, the final chapter. Let's just get this over with. Winkler walks back home, thinking about calling his boss and explaining everything and seeing if he can get his job back, because he says, as if they wouldn't. What, like they've already cleared his desk or something? This is Winkler we're talking about. So still literally no self-awareness or growth. And they have cleared his desk, so blah, blah, blah. Okay, I don't care. I'm very tired and hungry. He then says, and then Mary. It was time to settle down. He was 30 next month. Makes a chap think. Not everyone gets to marry Albuquerque, and Mary was quite good enough for Winkler, and he would be good enough for her. Mate, no you're not. You are not good enough for her. You've been cheating on her, you've been treating her badly, you've been talking crap about her this whole book and mocking her. And like, sorry, but if a man only wanted me because, oh, well, he can't get anything better, he wants his women, but he can't get them, he'll just have to settle for me. I'd be like, mate, no, not a chance. Never be someone's second option. None of that. On the way back, Winkler bumps into Arnold, the Jewish police officer who is actually Jewish, but Winkler's not Jewish, but Winkler doesn't tell him that he's not Jewish, so it's like a whole thing. And the police officer's like, mate, I got you, you're fine. No assault charge for beating up that rich guy at the cricket match as well. You know, you're off the murder charge. Everything is good, everything's good. We get a throwaway line about how apparently the real murderer of the goth girl, Jenny Marie, I think, I can't remember now, I don't care. Apparently they were, and I quote, asylum seeker, schizo, the full profile. We matched up the DNA the same time as we got yours in the panda car, and got an automatic reading for this Albanian scum. Great stereotyping you've got going on there. And then finally Winkler walks off, and then this other police officer comes up to Arnold, the police officer, and is like, hey, doesn't that look like the guy who pushed that woman under the train? And Arnold's like, ha ha ha, no, not at all. Besides, that woman was suicidal. And then they make up this whole thing about how because she was fat, she had the worst life ever, and she was really, really sad, so she must have jumped in front of the train, and it couldn't possibly have been Winkler doing it. So he gets away with that as well. Great. Winkler gets home and finds out that Wallenstein is dead, and they're taking out his body in a coffin, and they're going to go bury him and stuff like that. Giles attempts to be this self-aware narrator again, and he's clearly trying to go for this whole meta thing that just doesn't work. From the open front door of the house emerged a small, pale coffin, borne by more men in suits. Too small to contain Will or even Muriel. Mary, possibly, which would have made Winkler break into a trot, but he didn't, so it couldn't have been. So what? Obviously it's Wallenstein. It's too late to introduce anyone new and care that he's dead, except maybe the rabbit eater, poisoned by refrozen defrosted rabbit parts, inadequately stewed. But what would that prove? Or maybe someone beaten by Mulligan's hoodlums. Who cares about Mulligan? We've already forgotten about Mulligan. He didn't turn out to have much to do with anything. No, it's Wallenstein. No surprises. Well, maybe one little one, or maybe you won't be surprised. So it's revealed that the little old lady who lives in the room next door to Wallenstein was actually his wife the whole time, his estranged wife. And she tells Winkler and all of us reading that the whole story that Wallenstein told about his time in the war and the Holocaust was entirely made up. The best and only good part of this book didn't even happen. It was all some old man's fictional ramblings. He was just making this stuff up for fun. He isn't actually Jewish. He never was. He was never a prisoner of war. He was Polish and he was escaping something, but we're never really told what it was. And then apparently he had to, like, in order to, like, get asylum somewhere, he had to pretend to be Jewish, and it was like a whole thing, but it was all fiction. All made up. So this is why I was frustrated earlier. All those bits about me saying like these are the best parts of the book, and like how it could be really interesting to look at these two men, these two Jewish men who've grown up in different times and had different experiences. Neither of them are actually Jewish. It renders everything pointless. I hate it. Wallenstein is buried. The book ends. That is it. Sadly, everything got tied up quite nicely for Winkler at the end. We never see what happens with Mary or his job or anything like that. We just know that he faces no real consequences for any of the horrific actions he's done throughout this book. Everything we've been told as backstories for these characters that build them up and try and make them like fleshed out and stuff is all revealed to be lies. So we don't actually know anything about who these people really are, and none of it matters. I don't know what to say. And never have I felt a book has wasted my time more than this. Nothing happens in this book. It has nothing of any value to say. It's not funny, it's not witty, it's not clever. It's just trash. Complete and utter trash for like 400 pages. I don't think I have the energy to pull together all my thoughts into any kind of cohesive conclusion because I'm just exhausted by how bad this book is. And that's me done for the day. I don't have the energy to keep going with this. I have never read a worse book. This is by far the worst book I've ever reviewed on my channel, and I've been doing this many, many years now and read many, many bad books. So with that, please let me know your thoughts. oh God, the sun's coming in quite bright now. I'm absolutely exhausted and starving. I'm gonna go take my little Cookie Bear out for lunch now. We're gonna go have a little mummy daughter date, and it's gonna be nice, and I'm gonna calm down, and then I'm gonna come back and edit this. But yeah, for now, please let me know what you thought of this down in the comments. If you read this book yourself, would you read this book yourself? Have you ever experienced a worse book than this, or is this really the worst one out there? Please let me know your thoughts. I think the worst thing is, he got paid £30,000 for this book. Can you believe it? £30,000. Not worth it, is it? Not worth it. And it only got published because Giles is already like a big established name, so a big established publisher wanted to publish his book. If this was like some self-published crap, I'd be like, okay, well, you know, it's bad, but there's reasons why it's bad. This had a whole team of people behind it, and it's still this. Anyway, thank you for coming on this very, very frustrating journey with me. I am not very happy at the minute. I'm still a bit full of cold, so I'm still all sniffly and foggy brain, so thank you for putting up with me through that. And yeah, hopefully I will see you all again really soon. And yeah, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for watching. And the sun is really coming in now, so bye!